I worked at a local government agency for a long time. Each summer, we would get a crop of new interns. Most were fine, some caused issues, like when we caught two of them making out in the fire room. But overall, they were just normal kids from high school or college trying to get some work experience. In 2016, my department received an intern later than usual, right in the middle of summer. Warner was a bit older than the usual crowd, around my age, maybe late 20s. We initially hit it off pretty well, and although I found him sort of strange, I didn't mind since he was friendly and we had some common interests. He was the only person in my department who was even close to my age. The interns were all teenagers, and the regular staff averaged around 60, older than my mum. I was psyched to have a peer to chat to, so occasionally I would eat lunch with Warner or stop to talk at his cubicle. His strangeness was mostly an outsized personality, a mix of over-the-top enthusiasm with a bit of social awkwardness, and I got zero bad vibes from the guy. It wasn't before long that Warner started having major performance problems at work. He would produce little to no work on most days, no show or arrive late without informing anyone, and generally acted unprofessionally. One day, he showed up for work at 3:15 p.m. when our workday ended at 4:30. The office manager was livid and told him to go home. His behavior bothered nearly everyone in my office, but I did not supervise him, and we had plenty of slack interns in the past. While his antics were a bit of a spectacle, it wasn't a big deal to me. If you're wondering why he wasn't let go, 2 words: political favor. I found out from Warner himself that he was hired because his uncle donated to the campaign of our big boss. He wasn't going anywhere. Near the end of that summer, I put in my notice that I was leaving my job and relocated to a new state. Once Warner caught wind of this, he would constantly complain that it sucked I was leaving because we had barely any time to become friends. I would always laugh lightly in response and give a sympathetic, "yeah." He would start to monopolize my time at work more and more, and it became disruptive to the people who sat near me. I found it slightly annoying, but I was also extremely happy to be leaving that job for reasons unrelated to Warner, and I spent my last month there not caring much about what my co-workers thought. I tolerated him lingering by my desk. One day, he caught me leaving work and offered me a ride home. I usually took the bus, and occasionally other co-workers would offer me rides home if they were going my way, so this didn't seem odd to me. I accepted and walked to his car with him. It smelled awful and was full of garbage. He hastily cleared off the passenger seat and apologized. We got on our way, but once we were on the main road, he started begging me to stop and get dinner with him. I laughed and said he didn't need to ask me that insistently, and said that we could stop at a diner on the way. We had a nice meal with pleasant conversation. He was intelligent and had a variety of interests. Our political positions aligned, and we shared disdain for our cranky old co-workers. I had a good time. I expressed he didn't need to drive me all the way home, now that it was late, but he kept insisting, so I relented. As I directed him towards my house, he started in again with the whining about how our developing friendship was cut short because of my move. At this point, I was tired of hearing this. The decision to leave my job and move away from home was extremely difficult to make, and I was proud of how bold I was being. I stopped responding, and his whining faded out. We came up to the turn to get onto my street. and when I pointed it out, he accelerated and drove right past it, laughing. I laughed in a, "Oh my god, what are you doing?" thinking he was joking around. When I began giving instructions about how to turn around and get back, he began begging me to keep hanging out with him because he was lonely. This immediately set me on high alert. It suddenly hit me that I'm in a man's car, someone I don't know that well who doesn't exercise proper behavior at work, which is in the only context I know him, and now he's displaying weird behavior outside of work as well. My instinct was not to insist I be let out of his car. I felt as if this would escalate, and it could become something bad, and in hindsight, it may have been the right thing to do when I think about the type of person he turned out to be. I told him we could hang out at the park near my house if he wanted to talk, and he seemed to like the idea, and we parked and walked over. The pleasant conversations resumed, and beside the weird clinginess, he was perfectly fine to talk to, until he dumped his entire life story on me, including his prior arrests for theft, his heroin addiction, and related struggles with depression. I tried to be sympathetic, but I was very put off by this. It was a lot of highly personal information all at once, and I was still on high alert because of his prior behavior. I tried changing the subject by showing him pics of my dog. I scrolled one pic too far, and the next one was a photo of me wearing makeup and posting cutely, which is way different than the slob I was at work. He grabbed the phone and went, "Wow, you're very photogenic." I felt awkward and didn't say anything. There was a long silence. Then he launched forward into a weird tangent about how compatible we are and that we have similar interests, etc., etc., and that he wishes I wasn't moving so that I could try hanging out again, but on a date. I didn't say anything, and he broke the silence with, "Sorry I'm saying all this stuff. I'm actually really high right now. That's why I know where Riverside, bad neighborhood that had previously come up in conversation, is. I went there to buy. Otherwise I wouldn't have said it at all. I'm sorry." Internally, I freaked out. He had definitely put his addiction in the past tense, and I assumed it was something he was recovering from, not currently using. I also realized I had been in a car he was operating while under the influence. I don't know anything about heroin, so I was clueless, and I felt very, very stupid. He immediately started whining and begging me not to judge or hate him, and kept saying over and over again how nice I am and how understanding I am, that I'm pretty and smart. All these weird compliments interspersed with talking down about himself. I don't know what to do, so I smiled reassuringly and told him not to worry, but that I was tired and wanted to go home. That's when he began crying. He had this weird, wheezy sob with no tears. I sat there silently while he did this, trying to come up with some sort of graceful escape plan. My patience was wearing thin, and my anxiety was through the roof. It's a weird feeling to be annoyed and panicky at the same time. I stood up and apologized, said the park was close to my house so that I'd walk, and began to leave, when I remembered I'd left my things in his car. Trying a new approach, I casually mentioned that I forgot my stuff in his car, and joked that if he wanted my dirty lunch containers, he could keep them. He ceased his bizarre crying, stood up, ran over to his car to unlock it, and I grabbed my stuff out of his backseat. His demeanor changed drastically, as he calmly apologized for making things weird, and asked if he could drop me off at home so that I didn't have to walk alone at night. I said yes, but made him drop me off a block over my little side street, so that he wouldn't know which house was mine. I could end it there, but what bothered me the most about this guy happened after this encounter. A week or two after that weird evening, the end of August by this point, I had my last day on the job and moved 1,000 miles across the country. Warner would sometimes text me long ramblings, detailing his feelings about himself and about our missed opportunity. I didn't respond to these messages. Now that I wasn't near him, I didn't feel the need to placate. The texts stopped after a few weeks, and I forgot about him. Fast forward to February, and I get a text from a former co-worker. Her message said, "Sorry you had to hear about it this way." And her next message was a link to a local news article titled, "Man dies from wounds in Riverside stabbing Wednesday." Because of the way she worded it, I thought Warner was the victim. But when I read the article, it included his mugshot and the charges. He was the attacker. He murdered someone. I felt so shocked and disgusted. I couldn't believe I knew someone who killed another human. Later on, I called an old work friend for some details. Apparently, shortly after I left the job, he was fired for trashing the men's bathroom. Just threw around anything he could lift and poured all the soap out and smeared it all over the place. He then lost his apartment. Presumably, some of the articles about the stabbing described Warner as a homeless man. I have to assume that's how he ended up in the aforementioned Riverside. There are lots of homeless drug addicts who squat in abandoned houses. I wondered if the man he stabbed had refused to give him something that he wanted, and that's how he reacted to a hard no. I don't think I made all the wisest decisions during my interactions with Warner, but I'm glad I was able to avoid setting him off, since he was clearly not stable. Hands down, the worst intern I've ever encountered. Me, my wife, and our 2 children were on a trip from point A to point B. We planned to stop the first evening into our trip with a friend of ours who happened to be near our route. Since we would be arriving at about 1 a.m., our friend left the door unlocked so that we could let ourselves in. Now, this wasn't a large city by any means, but out in the sticks near DeKalb, Texas. So we slipped in as quietly as we could, went back to the room that had been set up for us, and proceeded to try and get some sleep. The room was roughly 10 by 10. Mobile home rooms, gotta love them. My daughter, the 4-year-old, was on a pallet of blankets on one side of the room, and my son started off there but got fussy, so my wife picked him up and let him sleep with us on the bed. The bed was pushed up in the corner, all the way, and I was sleeping up against the wall. My wife had the outside, and our son was somewhere in the mix. We closed the door and turned off the light. It's pitch dark. Roughly an hour later, I hear my wife scream that someone's in the room. I open my eyes and see a black figure move towards the door. I wear contacts, so I couldn't distinguish what I saw, only that it appeared to have been a human shape. I leapt from the bed and bear hugged the intruder. The problem was I couldn't get a hold of it. I could feel its body up against mine, but every time I went to bear hug it, my arms went through it. I could see the blackness. I felt the shape up against my body, but couldn't grab it. I was pushed away from whatever it was, and heard my wife scream something about the light. I went from where I thought the light switch was, and felt something clawing and scratching on my upper body. I found the light switch on the wall, and saw nothing. Absolutely nothing. Well, other than the damage from what looked like a tornado had hit our room, my wife was still in bed, scared, witless. My daughter was on one of the open corners of the room, cowering under a blanket, and my infant son was on the floor next to the bed. Being the manly man that I am, I did the most sane thing I've ever done, and that was open the door to the room. A bathroom was right next to our room, you see. Flicked on the light, and no one was in there. I turned on the next light I could find, and no one was there. I checked the front door. It was deadlocked and deadbolted from the inside. You can't leave a house and deadbolt a door from the inside. There were no other sounds, noises, or movement, and I run back to our room and call a friend. Yes, I should have checked physically, but at this point my adrenaline was wearing off, and panic was starting to settle in. Our friend answered and said she was okay, and then she walks down to our room where we take in what happened. My wife has calmed the baby and our daughter down. They're all fine. My wife has blood pouring from her mouth and can barely speak, and has deep scratch marks from her neck to her ears down to her breasts. I have a fat, bloody lip, deep scratch marks on my chest, neck and back, even though I'd slept in a shirt that night. And I also have what looks like carpet burn on the top of my right foot. The sewing machine table that was in the room had been thrown across near where my daughter was laying. After we calmed down and collected our wits, we started probing what we just went through. I recounted everything you've heard, and my wife said that she heard the door open and a big black cat jump on her chest and began clawing at her. Its face was smushed up against hers, causing her to feel strangled. The cat then started using its paws to strangle her. She gasped out that someone was in the room, which is when I awoke to see a black figure moving across it. While this was going on, our friend heard absolutely nothing. No shouts, no bumping around, nothing. Our friend and most others that we've told the story to thinks that my wife and I were fighting each other in our sleep, which I'm not past believing. She sleeps with her eyes open at times and used to sleepwalk when she was younger, but we don't think this is the case. We've told a few other friends about it, and they've stated they've had similar experiences. Big black cat strangling someone in bed, and another person wakes up to see something, but the something gets away. The next thing that makes me think this wasn't a dream gone bad were my wounds. My wife's healed up fine. It took 2 months for the scratches on my chest, neck and back to completely go away. The carpet burn, however, took 4 months to heal. We tried medicating ointments and nothing worked. We went to our doctor, but at that point it had begun clearing up on its own, and he didn't want to do anything. He made a comment saying that the spot looked like it had been burned. If you've ever seen a 3rd-degree burn, it looks similar. Now, I can believe that my wife can make the scratches, but not what was on my foot. You can make out a slightly visible scar through my hobbit-like foot hair. I am of the persuasion that these events were something spiritual. Last year, I was cycling in Tuscany on holiday. I knew the guy who ran it, as it was my coach who also runs a national race team. We're a close-knit bunch on the holiday, as most people know each other from riding together back home. Later in our trip, the coach is talking about something strange that happened to him the night before. I didn't hear him at the time, as I was using the climbs as training and pushing on. We stop for lunch and he starts talking about his experience, and I ask him what he's talking about. He goes on to explain that he was asleep, and then all of a sudden he starts hearing talking, but just a little bit, as he thinks that it's very weird, as he's alone in that part of the villa, as it's a massive place that's been split into apartments. And he sits up and then gets pushed back down. In the morning, he calls his wife back home, and she said she'd felt something when she was out there with him earlier that week, like she was being watched. Now, on hearing this, I started mocking him, and back at the villa, I carry it on. So 2 nights later, it's still a topic for jokes. We go to bed, and I crash. Then at 2 a.m. I wake up, and can't sleep. So I just lay there. Then I hear talking, and think that it's my mate in the room next door, who I'm sharing the apartment with, just talking to his wife back home in England. So I think nothing of it. About 30 minutes later, I'm tossing and turning, when out of nowhere I feel like my head is being pushed into the pillow, and someone is holding my shoulder down as well. I was freaking out. It stops seconds later, but feels longer, and as it stops I hear a laugh, and I didn't sleep again that night. I told him in the morning what happened, and he thought I was winding him up. We've since found out that the villa has a history of things happening. Also, his apartment and mine are joined by a door. The rest are completely separate. We're back there again next month. I won't be mocking anyone though, as I don't want karma to take effect. I had been sent to Korea from my university a few years ago. They told me for my major I had to go somewhere in Asia, and my friend had really talked up Korea for me. I knew nothing about it, but I decided what the hell, and embarked on a semester-long trip. I had only one serious boyfriend in my life, who I had broken up with a few months prior. I also don't enjoy one-night stands, and wasn't digging the dudes at the clubs in Seoul, but I still wanted to have some sort of romantic experience. So my friend recommended I use this dating app to meet English-speaking Koreans. That way, I could meet someone and experience the actual dating culture. I thought, I'm young, why not? I was just so eager to have the new experience. Maybe it sounds dumb to try dating in a foreign country, but it worked out for me eventually. Just not the first date. I met him on a dating app after being in Seoul for 3 weeks. We'll call him Tim. I still didn't know the culture or city very well, and was a bit naive about everything. He eagerly wanted to meet for a date after talking to me, and he seemed nice. I should have asked more questions, and I should have noticed that he was not giving me many details about himself. Tim was a guy a little older than me, but claimed he was a college student. I assumed he had done his military time, which all men in Korea have to do, and returned to school. We talked for a bit and decided to meet for a tea date near the school I went to. He wanted to come to my dorm originally to pick me up, but I live in an all-women's dorm and didn't want him to know exactly where I lived since we were still strangers. So instead, I insisted we meet at the main town center near the subway. He really didn't like this idea, which, looking back, was a red flag. But eventually I insisted. The night of the date, I waited an hour for this guy. He was very late. Tim weirdly claimed he just wanted to make me wait. I thought he was kidding, and messaged him a laughing emoji, assuming he was just lost. When he finally arrived, he was much smaller than I thought, but a man's height has never been something I care about much. He was also quite thin. Maybe I let my guard down because I didn't see him as physically threatening to me, which was a mistake in the end. Right off the bat, he was way too touchy with me, and breathed creepy and heavy. I was so put off by his demeanor. I'm usually very tolerant with different personality types, but this was very odd to me. I had been told that Korean men would be polite and not so touchy on the first date. He was also dressed oddly like in business attire for a date, but I thought that maybe it was just a Korean thing. The first thing he said to me was, "You're not as white as I thought you were." I thought this was a translation error, that his English was near perfect, so I asked for clarification, and he said what he meant. "I thought you would be more white. Your skin is darker, and your eyes aren't green. Are you pure European?" Now I was officially weirded out. First of all, I'm pretty much as white as you can get. I'm Irish and Scandinavian, so white as hell basically. So the fact he thought I could have possibly been any whiter was funny. And why did he care in the first place anyway? Why does my skin color matter to this guy? And why is he bringing it up? He said it about 3 times on the date, how he wished I had greener eyes, and every time I would just reply, "Well, maybe my online photos make me look brighter," and brushed it off as him being nervous and trying to start a conversation. Isn't it funny the dumb excuses you make for people when you're panicked? When we arrived at the tea place, I tried to order a basic raspberry tea, and he stopped me and told me I had to have this special tea. I thought it was weird he wanted to choose my tea for me, but in my head I brushed it off once again. He really insisted I drink only this type of tea, and I just agreed. These small details become weirder later. After tea, he asked if we could look around my school. It was dark, but the school is very well lit, so I agreed. And the whole time we walked around, he would randomly stop and grab me for long hugs. At first, I let it happen, but then I stopped him, and he continued trying. He kept grabbing me and breathing hard into my neck. It was so awkward. He also wouldn't tell me any personal details about himself. I asked so many questions, desperately trying to distract from all the awkward grabbing, and to try and get to know him. But he would never tell me anything. He even said at one point, "I'm a mysterious man," like a movie line. He also said something like, "You look so much like my favorite movie character." I asked him who that would be, but he said that I would need to figure it out on my own. Finally, he said, "I want to go to a dark area." And in my head I screamed, "Hell no." At this point, I wanted the date to be over fast. He somehow knew there was a wooded area behind my campus, and he said that we should go there. I said no, and that I wanted to stay near the main campus in town, but he kept pushing. Finally, he grabbed my arm and started dragging me there. He said, "I can't let anyone see," and I started to panic. I finally ripped my arm away and just demanded we leave and go back to the main road immediately. Looking back, I don't know why I didn't ask for help or get angry. Maybe I was scared, but I just began to book it back to the main road, and he followed. We ended up in front of a hospital near the town center, and I told him it was time for him to go. I made some excuse, and he was pleading with me to stay. I told him, and lied, that we could meet the next day, and that I would message him. I just wanted to get away at this point. I was pretending everything was fine, in order for him to go. Suddenly, I think he's leaning in to kiss me, and I immediately think, "Oh God, no," but it was so much worse. Instead, I feel pain in my face. It takes me a second to realize he was biting my face. It was like a dog. I had never felt the sensation before. He leaned his head sideways and bit me on my nose and cheek as hard as he could. I screamed and pushed him away. His face looked so freaky, I barely had any time to react in words. Instead, I ran up the sidewalk until I saw a convenience store on the right, ran into the back of the store, and bent down and started to cry. The man who owned the store started to yell at me, but I couldn't explain my situation. I just begged him in English to let me stay, and I ended up having to buy a popsicle to stick around. God, I wish I had learned some Korean by then. I guess Tim didn't follow me. I appeared outside the store and didn't see him. I texted a friend and waited for them to get me to take me back to my dorm. On the way, I messaged Tim and basically told him to stay away from me. I told him he was a creep and that he shouldn't bite women, and something along the lines of me calling the police, and then blocked him. I was so scared to walk around my school area after that. I was so afraid he would find me somehow, and I'm so thankful I never let him pick me up at my dorm. I called my mum to tell her what happened, when suddenly she said, "Wait, what did he ask you?" She then put some details together and realized all of these weird things had to do with the 50 Shades of Grey books. At first, I thought she was just being silly and overthinking a bad date. I thought she was joking. But oh God, she was right. She'd recently seen the movie or read the book. The eye color, the way he dressed, and the tea he made me drink, and the random lines he said, it all matched the books and movies for his dirty little fantasy. My mum thinks he picked me because I looked like the girl from the movie to him. It explains why he was so fixated on my appearance and his whole thing with the biting and trying to dominate me. Even if it wasn't his intention, I later learned that there are a few creeps who seek out foreign girls to dominate and sleep with as a prize. They call it riding the white horse, or something along those lines. On a happier note, this bad experience didn't stop me. I eventually met someone else in Korea, and we ended up falling in love. We even did the whole long distance thing, and now I'm living in Korea studying and working, hoping to marry soon. So I guess I didn't let bad creepy guys stop my life. As for Tim, let's not meet. It's been years, but I will still kick your ass if I see you, and I won't have to bite. I own this house down in South Georgia, near a town in the middle of nowhere called Moultrie. It's just a double-wide mobile home that's been seated on a foundation, so it qualifies as a house on the insurance. Anyway, the house itself isn't old. I lived there about 2 years before moving up to Atlanta to take a better job. While I lived there, I smoked often and always outside because I have kids. So from my front yard there was a large clearing across the road. It was overgrown with weeds and the like, but you could sort of tell that a house used to be there. Within weeks of my family moving in, I began to feel freaked out by being out on my front porch at night. During the day I felt absolutely normal. There was something about the night that just didn't sit well, and I considered myself a believer in the paranormal and maybe a mild clairvoyant. So I felt like I knew that there was something. I was being watched, and so many people described these sort of events. I convinced myself it was nothing though, and simply fixed the issue by smoking out back instead of out front at night. My mum was over one afternoon during a small family grill out, and we were walking around the front lawn, just checking out the garden. The sun was near setting, and you could barely see the light fading over the horizon when she went wide-eyed and stopped talking mid-sentence. I asked her what was wrong, and she just slowly lifts her hands and points in the direction of the aforementioned clearing. It was across the dirt road from my property, and I look towards that direction as I do, and see a dark shadow simply go from what looked like a dog form crouching over to a full bipedal humanoid shape. This thing was 10 feet tall. I mean, huge, if it were human. So I blink and rub my eyes for a second, before asking my mum, "Do you see what I see?" She confirmed by nodding, but is unable to make words. At this point, I'm really getting scared. Now I know that I wasn't mistaken by my feelings of being watched. I tell her we need to go inside. She agrees, so we begin to walk towards my front door slowly. At that moment, my spidey senses go off, and I turn to look back at the thing, as it does what looks like charge across the dirt road towards my lawn. I panic, my mum panics, and suddenly the creature lurches back, as though it ran into an invisible wall. We made it to the porch at that moment, and I have one foot in the door when my mum finally speaks and says, "Wait, it looks like it stopped." When I focus again on the thing, I notice it has no eyes, no defining form, only the dark outline of a shadow overcasting the already dark background of tall grass and the clearing with the surrounding trees. The thing charges forward again, but lurches back at the edge of the lawn. Freaked out, we assume it's paranormal, and there's nothing we can do about it. So we head inside. We tell everyone in there, and of course they think we're messing with them. Eventually everyone goes home. Then I discuss it with my wife, who tells me to stop playing around. I wouldn't go out front at night again, and shortly thereafter we moved out into Atlanta. I knew the previous owners personally and contacted their son, my friends, to see if they had ever experienced anything like that. They said no, but strangely they had witnessed angels at the four corners of the lawn before. I'm not Christian, and am barely religious, more of a spiritual thing, so I go along with it since they are and listen carefully. Apparently their dad was a pastor at a church, and in doing so prayed constantly over the land and his family. Now, be it strange or not, the fact that they have claimed to seen angels at the four corners of the lawn, and that I have just witnessed who knows what, attempting to enter the lawn and almost being pushed back to the edge, was unsettling. The story ends anticlimactically, with me simply not going outside at night anymore. At least, not to the front. We move and try to forget it happened. I've since rented the place out to another family, and I haven't heard them say anything about it, though I did request they keep an eye on their kids and not let them go across the road there. I later found out the house that used to be there had a small family that lived in it. The teenager actually went to middle school with me, but I never knew him. He ended his own life 3 years before I moved there, and the house across the street was demolished shortly thereafter. I won't ever cross the street again, and I wouldn't advise anyone else to do it either. I am a 31-year-old female. This happened when I was about 15 years old, and to this day I have a thing for big, wide eyes. They truly creep me the hell out. When I was 15, I had chores, like most teenagers do. One of my chores was to mow the lawn every now and again. I live in Cincinnati, so in the summer it's extremely humid. On this particular day, I was mowing the grass. I was wearing shorts and a crop top. I mowed the front, and that was that. Now at the time I lived off an extremely busy street, that ran through my little town. A few weeks later, my mum and dad decided to sell the boat we had sitting in our driveway. I lived in a little town about 35 minutes away from downtown Cincinnati, and it was in Claremont County. So on the day this happened, it was just my mum, my little sister who was 6 at the time, and myself. My dog was there too, but she was a miniature pinscher, so her bark was bigger than her bite. It wasn't her fault, she was only like 6 pounds, so she tried. So I hear my mum shouting for me, asking if I knew who drove the red truck that had just pulled into our driveway. I told her I didn't. She says maybe he's here about the boat. So her and I are looking out the door window. We had one of those wooden doors, but it had glass at the top so that you could see out directly. And also that means you can see in directly. So we're watching this man, and he's not moving. He's just staring straight ahead, and begins revving his engine like he's going to ram through our family room bay window. My mum knew something isn't right. She steps outside onto our porch, staying very close to the door, and yells, "Excuse me, sir, can I help you with anything? Are you interested in the boat for sale?" He proceeds to rev his engine louder still. My mum quickly grabs my sister and me and puts us in my bedroom and tells us to lock the doors and to not come out regardless of what she hears. I grab my little dog and am holding the dog and my sister. Then I remember that the sliding office doors are all open and unlocked, only the screen doors are closed. My mum had an extension built on the house as a home office because she was a realtor. So I began to think, with so many open ways, my mum can't do this alone. I opened my bedroom window, which leads to the backyard, which we had a huge privacy fence, so I knew that she'd be safe with the open window. And I put my deck chair up against it and tell her to lock the doors, and if I'm not back in 5 minutes, to go out the window through the little opening all the way to the other end of our backyard, which leads to the neighbors, and to take the dog with her and call 911. I give her a hug and a smile and told her everything would be okay, and locked the door behind me. When I peek around the corner into the living room, I see my mum pushing on the front door with a shotgun, and this man has his face pressed against the glass with his huge eyes. They're wide and crazy looking, and I instantly freak the hell out. I begin to army crawl through the living room and past the door so that he can't see me, and so I don't distract my mum. My dad collected stuff from World War I or II and kept them on the bookshelf by the kitchen and dining room. I grab his bayonet off the bookshelf and continue to army crawl to the office. I quickly shut and lock all the sliding glass doors, so the only way this man is getting through is the front door. Once I have the office secure, I quickly dial 911 and go over to the door where the man is and push on the door with my mother, looking at his huge, crazy ass eyes, and yell that I've called the police and they're on their way. At this, he quickly returns to his truck. My mum gets the door secure, and then we hear the revving, only this time it's more aggressive and extreme. We're convinced he's going to ram his truck through our family bay windows. He's getting in before the police come. I hand my mum the phone and go running to my room. I knock to tell my sister to open the door, and it takes her a minute, but she does manage to unlock it. I knock just as she has begun to climb the chair to the window to run to the back neighbor. Thank goodness I'm caught her in time, because this man didn't ram our bay window. Instead, he took off, but his lips and nose prints remained on our front door on the glass. When the police did arrive, we explained what he was driving and what he looked like. I had gotten his plate number also, and they found him 10 minutes up the street at a Gold Star. It took 6 policemen to take him down and put him into custody. He claimed to have an epileptic seizure and had no memory of what happened to him. Turns out what really caused this random big-eyed psycho to try and break into our house was a few days previously he saw me outside mowing grass and my mum working on the flower bed and thought we were very pretty. I lived in a pretty small area in Clermont County, so I'd seen him around. His family had money, so he got off pretty easily given what he did. Whenever I'd see him, which was mainly where I worked, I had to go to the back and stay there until he left. So to the man whose name I can't put in here and caused me to literally be terrified of big eyes, please, let's never meet again. Out of high school, I worked at a cute little shop that sold gift baskets, goodies, and all sorts of home decor. This was before Big Box Hobby Lobby, and at the time, the store was one of the most popular places to go in town to get cute things for your house or great gifts for people. The store was actually located in one of the oldest houses in the area. All the stores around there were actually houses at one time, and it became this cute, quaint shopping area. For a long time after I started, none of the other workers discussed that the house/shop was haunted. I don't think they were purposefully keeping it from me, it just didn't come up. The shop/house was a 2-story, with a basement and attic as well. We always stayed open until 7:30 p.m. during the week, and there were always 2 closers for safety. When closing up, the front doors were locked to prevent any customers from coming in, and you can believe we locked that up on the dot so that we could clean up, balance the register, and get the heck out of there. There was a back door, but we kept that locked too. Those are the only 2 ways in and out of the house/store. On the night something happened to my friend Amanda and I, we were closing and the front door was locked up. We're cleaning, doing our thing as normal, and we're about to go, and had walked through the shop top to bottom, turning off all the lights, and we're standing at the back door, when out of nowhere, we heard the most evil laugh I've ever heard in my entire life. We both freak out, grab each other, and did the thing that you shouldn't do in every horror movie, which is run to the basement. In my defense, that's where the phone was. We ran back upstairs, busted out the back door, and called the cops. We called the owners too. They showed up and cleared the place, and were more than understanding, and indicated they got calls to old houses all the time. The owner's husband shows up, and he was clearly perturbed at us for having called the cops, and said that we should have called him first, and that we're just a bunch of silly girls. However, he then begins to proceed to tell us a story about how when he was doing bookwork one evening in the basement, he heard voices upstairs. So he went up to investigate, thinking his wife and daughter had stopped by. He got up, and the voices stopped. So he went back downstairs and got back to work. He said he then heard them again and returned to the upstairs part, and this time the conversation continued while he was standing there, and he himself skedaddled out of there. He never did tell us what he overheard specifically. Obviously, the story got out amongst the staff about our experience, and people started talking about theirs. Someone told us they saw jelly jars flying right off the shelf. Another co-worker told us she would be balancing the register and she could hear furniture upstairs being dragged back and forth, when the shop was totally devoid of customers, and her closing partner was in the back cleaning up. One of the managers told us that frequently when opening in the morning, she would go upstairs to turn on all the lights, and would hear sounds of little girls playing in what would have been one of the house's bedrooms. The husband and wife would get very upset if you referred to what was going on in the house/shop as a haunting or a ghost. She was a woman of great faith, and she would always say that they were her angels. I can honestly say nothing further ever happened to me when I was working there, but it was totally creepy afterwards, especially to turn the lights off upstairs or having to go to the attic and/or basement. Follow up to this story, here I am almost 20 years later, and I live across the street from someone who now owns the building and has a different shop in it. The next time I catch her, I'm going to try and not look crazy and just ask her if she's experienced anything there. In early 2017, I had just moved to a large city in the southwest US that enjoys a fair amount of violent and property crime. I'm a skinny white male in my mid to late 20s, not exactly a hardened warrior, but I was just trying my best to adjust to this harsh environment. My girlfriend at the time's parents had just bought a house in a quiet neighborhood for her and I to live in. Most of the houses in the area had bars on the windows and doors to prevent burglary. The previous owners had removed the bars from our house prior to selling it, probably because they thought the bars would lower the home's value due to a perception of danger. This meant we were the only houses in the neighborhood with exposed windows and doors. To add to that, the house was on a corner next to a road that led straight to a main road. So in the event of a burglary, the getaway would be rather simple. My ex and I were in the habit of going to a fast food joint every day for lunch before she went to work. We left the house one day and got in the car on our way to get lunch, and I happened to glance over and notice a man standing on the corner across the street. He's moving erratically, as if waiting eagerly, and seems to be staring directly at us. He's Hispanic, mid-20s probably, with a fresh fade haircut, long shorts, and a shirt that's way oversized. The sort of clothes that make you think, maybe this guy is accustomed to doing crimes. I say to my ex, let's not go anywhere. Let's go back in. Once back inside, I explained to her my thought process, that this dude on the corner looks like he's staking the place out for a robbery, waiting for us to leave. My mind starts racing, and I go into emergency freakout mode. I go downstairs into the basement, where a narrow window overlooks the street. I can see the corner where he's standing, and he's no longer there. I see he has crossed the street, and is now leaning against a fence diagonal from our house, looking straight at the house. He looks agitated, like he's a little pissed off we haven't left. It looks like he thinks we've just gone in for a second and will be leaving again soon, so he's waiting. I think he must be very stupid to think he's inconspicuous, standing right there looking all antsy. I call the non-emergency police number, and it takes several minutes for them to answer. When they finally pick up, I explain my concern, and to my surprise they take it pretty seriously. She asks for a description, and if he appears to be on drugs. I note that he appears to be on some kind of stimulant, based on his agitated and antsy gestures. The operator tells me they'll send an officer to check him out, and that is the end of the call. I look out the window, and he's gone. Since I feel my house is being actively scoped out for an invasion, and I have several collectible things and adore my cat, I want to do everything I can to prevent that. I go outside, since I'm new to the neighborhood, and suddenly scared, it seems like it's a great time to introduce myself to the neighbors. I see a guy pull up in a truck across the street on the corner where I initially saw the creep. So I walk over towards him. As I'm approaching his truck, I see the creep coming down the street towards me. It appears he had taken a stroll around the block and was looping back. I approached the man exiting his truck and introduced myself. He wasn't the neighbor but some local delivery guy. Crap. I start walking back to my house, and somehow the creep isn't walking very fast behind me. I'm not exactly sure what to do, but I want to show a strong presence of guardianship. I turn on the water hose in the front yard and start watering the bushes. The creep is slowly slinking by on the sidewalk looking at me. I look at him and ask, "How's it going, man?" He stops on the sidewalk directly in front of the house, looks at me and says, "Good." I say, "Just so you know, I'm gonna be here all day." I was working from home at the time, so this was true. "Oh yeah?" he says, and steps into the yard a bit. His body language isn't exactly aggressive. It's just like we're having a normal conversation, which is disturbing to me. The fact that he's so calm and engaging me is unsettling. Like he isn't intimidated that I'm calling him out. Since he stepped onto the yard a bit, I sort of point around his feet and say, "That's private property." At that point he appears to take the hint and continues walking down the street. After he's out of sight, I knock on some doors on my block, introduce myself, and explain the situation. I think my instincts definitely kicked in, and any shyness or fear of awkward intrusions was totally demolished by my drive to survive. I met an old lady across the street, weak but potentially helpful as a lookout. I continued down the street and spotted a middle-aged Hispanic man talking with a middle-aged white male guy with a long grey beard. I approached them, introduced myself, and asked them if they noticed a creepy guy walking around. Turns out they did. That is what they were discussing. The Hispanic male, Dan, told me that he knew where the guy lived, and asked if I wanted to get into his truck and drive by his apartment. I agreed, and jumped into his truck, nearly sitting on top of a pistol that was laying on the passenger seat. Yup, he was armed, which was actually a bit of a relief, as I'm not a gun person at all. We drove a few blocks down to the end of the street, and he pointed out what he suspected was the creep's apartment. Sure enough, the creep was leaning against a wall wearing totally different clothes. Being a criminal mastermind, he'd decided to run home and change outfits to not arouse suspicion. He didn't seem to notice us drive by. Dan said that he'd brought his gun in case he felt like scaring the creep. He was a pretty ballsy guy. Apparently he'd seen that guy walking up and down our street earlier in the day. One of the neighbors reported to Dan that the creep was peering into his nephew's truck, which was parked on the street, and Dan had to scare him away, but continued walking up and down the street as if plotting something. We drove back towards our homes, and he dropped me off. We exchanged phone numbers and agreed to keep an eye out. During my discussion with the neighbors, I had also met a proactive young man who lived on the street, who also claimed to have seen the creep. We also exchanged numbers. I was beginning to form a sort of neighborhood local watch, and it felt pretty cool, but I was still scared. I'd had some fantasies crossing my mind, like what if this guy was part of a larger gang, and he's just a scout. I felt like me and my girlfriend were in danger, and all the while my ex is in the house getting ready for work. I'm afraid that when she leaves, I'll be home alone, it'll be dark, and this terrifying person will come into the house armed. I continue to pace around, checking the windows every few minutes for any sight of him. I look out the window, and he's standing in the street directly in front of the house, looking directly towards us. Oh gosh, he's threatening me. He thought about what I said earlier, about this being private property, and he's blatantly testing me. So I call the cops again, explain the situation, and that he's standing right in front of my house in a very aggressive gesture, as a sort of psychological attack. Again, the operator is really understanding, and says that he'll send someone to talk to him. He disappears. I continue pacing the house, looking out the windows, and I see him walk back and forth down the street, seemingly doing more laps of the block. Finally, 2 police show up. I can see through the window that they stopped him a bit down the street and are talking to him. I can also see Dan has stopped his truck nearby and is speaking with him as well. But there was no way I was going out there to speak to them while he was there. I watch. At some point, the creep retreats back to his apartment. They let him go. I guess they didn't have anything on him, as he hadn't broken any laws, so he was free to roam. I walk out to speak with the cops and tell them I'm the one that called and that I don't feel safe. They explained that the guy appeared to be high, said that he had smoked some synthetic weed and that he appeared to be hearing voices. This was kind of a relief, because I thought he was some sort of cunning professional criminal, not a dumbass, but nonetheless I still didn't feel safe. The cops explained they can't do anything unless he's actively trespassing or doing some crime. I'm glad they at least spoke to him, and figured that that would dissuade him from continuing to creep around the block, which it did. I spoke to Dan after the cops left, and he mentioned how the creep was saying, "I want that truck," to the cops. I couldn't believe I didn't realize it before. This whole time I thought he wanted something in my house, but he was really interested in Dan's nephew's red truck parked on the street, which was standing in front of my house. I think he was trying to maintain distance from Dan's house because he has a gun. Even still, my adrenaline glands had been through the ringer that day, and I was pretty much in a state of high tension for the rest of the night. A friend came over to hang out completely out of sympathy, so that I wasn't alone and terrified. It might not sound that scary to you, but the feeling that this individual was targeting me, and then the feeling that he was threatening me personally after I engaged him, was highly disturbing. Either way, my vigilance and paranoid nature ended up helping out my neighborhood and strengthening the bonds between the people who lived around me. I got out of the city, and am back in the calm, liberal city where most of the criminals are the people who don't pick up their dog poop at the park and fart in yoga classes. My father had been dating this girl for a while, and things were going great. She met us a few times and got along great with my sister and I. Eventually, my father asked her to move in with us. She drove 7 hours to move in and brought along her 2 cats. Things were great for the first 2 months, until she couldn't find a job. They had agreed that she would apply for jobs and have one secured for an interview before she moved in. She moved in on July 2nd and still didn't have a job until late January. I, being fresh out of high school with no experience in a job setting, was able to get a job before her. This caused my father to have to cover her car payments and insurance, which set us back financially. Then October came with the discovery of a full year's worth of text messages between her and a friend of hers named Jared, all taking place after my father and her were dating, and all while she was still living in her hometown. These text messages were laced with him coming over and giving her nighttime love-ins and inappropriate pictures. My father confronted her about it, and she denied it, saying we just didn't understand her friendships. My father lets it go, as they hadn't messaged each other in weeks. Small arguments pop up, and she starts sneaking money out of my dad's wallet at night to go buy cigarettes. This may only sound like small amounts, but it was a nightly occurrence. This set us back financially as well. These arguments mainly consisted of her lying about something and not admitting it, or her doing something stupid and not apologizing. Things got worse as Christmas came. My father expressed that he didn't love her anymore. He didn't have any feelings towards her, and that she needed to work to fix the relationship if she wanted to continue. This meant really trying to get a job and not lying about everything. She agreed that she would. I advised him against giving her the option. I was tired of this and wanted her out. She began lying more and more and causing more problems. We believe she started taking some sort of drug, as she would come back from a drive all shaky and spazzing out, spouting nonsense. She came after myself and a friend of mine during one of their arguments, to which my father responded, "Pack your stuff and get out. How dare you go after my kids?" Telling her to get out and leave was a regular occurrence in their fights, but she never took the hint. She was abusive emotionally to everyone in the household, especially my father, reducing him to tears when he found out she had been receiving $1,000 a month from her mother, which would have had us staying up to date on rent payments. We have no idea what she did with the money. No matter the situation, she would try to twist it so that she would be the victim, even calling my father, asking second opinions, the party of persecuting Martha. Nothing is ever her fault, and it's always a misunderstanding. Then she started smoking in the garage. The door from the garage into the house is right across from my bedroom door, which is always open because our cats like sleeping on my bed with me. I have asthma. I woke up coughing and smelling cigarettes multiple times in one night because of her. She drove recklessly with my little sister and I in the car before, and I told my father what happened. When my father confronted her on it, she said that I was over-exaggerating, and that my sister and I, in our "it's too early for this, I'm gonna sleep and listen to my earbud" state, was stressing her out. A minor thing, but she endangered my sister's and my own cats. We have 2 strictly indoor cats, and her 2 were outdoor cats until they moved here. Her cats have taught mine how to sneak out the house when the front door isn't latched. She constantly leaves the front door open when she comes back in from smoking, and lets my cats get out. We live across the street from a huge lot of desert, and where the coyotes roam every night, and she lets them out before. After she finally got a job, she didn't want to contribute her fair share of bills. My father asked her for half her paychecks every 2 weeks, and she claimed she could only give 25% because there are 4 people in the house. My sister and I are only there on the weekends, as we go to school outside of town an hour away and stay with other family during that time. She also apparently wasn't paying her car payments after she got a job, and she got a repossession notice which she hid from my father. Finally, after financially wrecking us, abusing my father emotionally and financially, endangering myself and my sister, doing drugs, taking money, stealing things from our rooms, endangering my cats and many other things, my father gave her 2 weeks to move out. She moved out a few days ago. She originally left her cats but failed to pay my father the $350 she owed him, so he said that we would be taking care of the cats until he got the money. She flipped and burst into the house when I was there alone, saying horrible things about my father and that her babies weren't safe there. When I called her out for not paying the money and everything, she told me that I was sipping the Kool-Aid, and I wish I was joking about this. I finally shut the door to my bedroom and started sobbing, as I couldn't handle this. She came after me, by banging on my bedroom door and saying how horrible I was, and slammed the door in my face. I rang my father on FaceTime and opened up my bedroom door, and she bolted into the garage. I followed her while my father screamed at her to give me her key to the house. She ran past me screaming nonsense, went back to the living room, and I finally had had enough with my dad on the phone and let her have it. I was yelling, screaming, cursing, and was mad, and there was nothing for me to lose at this point. I finally told her to get the hell out of my house. She grabbed her cats by the scruff and ran out. I worry for those cats. I loved them dearly, and they became such a huge part of our family. I wish them nothing but comfort and happiness, despite their owner. When I was a child, I woke up to footsteps on the roof of my apartment as I lived on the top floor. It sounded like something was running across the roof. Being a young child and not really knowing when Christmas was, I ran into my parents' room as they slept and was excited, telling them that Santa and his reindeer were on the roof. They woke up and told me to go back to sleep as it wasn't anywhere near Christmas. So I go back into my room and closed the door. I laid in my bed and clearly remembered a tall figure which was shadowy, and can't remember any more of what happened after what I saw. After the event, all my life I've seen shadow figures. I've had dreams of grey aliens and having medical type experimentations done on me, and have woken up with scars that are perfect incisions that were made overnight and healed completely once I awoke. One time, I was in my grandparents' backyard around 1 or 2 a.m. with my Siberian husky and ex-girlfriend. We were sitting on a picnic bench just looking at the stars, as I would constantly see stars in space that started moving back and forth, as they were objects in space that were being flown by intelligence and enjoying the nice night. They lived in a rural area with practically no light pollution, and you could see so many stars it was quite beautiful and breathtaking. On this particular night, we were out there with the dog facing the forest, with about 4 acres of my grandparents' yard between us and the forest. We began to hear loud screams that didn't sound like human, fox, nor owl. Not to mention, the closest home was a mile or 2 away. And then all of a sudden my husky started barking at something in the field, and my ex and myself assumed it would be a deer or something like that, as only the dog could see it. The field was big and it was hard to see, so we calmed down the dog and continued to ignore him until he began snarling. I got down to the dog's level and tried to see which area of the field he was looking at, and tried to focus my eyes and saw a tall figure, and it made this screeching sound that I would constantly hear all the time. Instead of trying to run after it, my dog on a leash tried to run away, so my ex and I bolted inside, as she also saw it. Take it as you will, but when I lived in that house when I was alone, I felt like I was constantly being watched, even when I would walk upstairs and have to run up them, as I felt something was behind me that I couldn't see. I had a dream the other night, a lucid dream mind you, that I was with a guy whom I've never seen, but this guy seemed familiar. He had headphones on listening to music, the big over-ear studio headphones, and he proceeded to take the headphones off and place them in my head, which a folk rock song started to play as clear as day, a song I've never heard in my life. And all of a sudden, after I heard the music, the guy morphed into a grey-brown type alien, and my surroundings changed, and all of a sudden I was lying on some medical procedure table inside of a craft, and I instantly awoke and started crying. The alien in my dreams looked all the same with insane detail. Anytime I think about that event, seeing the tall shadow figure behind my door after closing it as a child makes me cry and sends chills throughout my whole body. Thank you for letting me share my stories. They have bothered me my whole life. I haven't shared these events and dreams with anyone except my current girlfriend. I'm 31 years old and figured it was time to share, regardless of what people think of me. I moved to Prague in the Czech Republic to work as a private teacher after I figured that the labor situation was far from good in my home country of Belgium for recent graduates. My girlfriend and I are renting an apartment in Hradčanska. That area is fairly close from Prague Castle. It is a duplex located on the last floor of the building, which must be around 80 to 100 years old. However, the apartment where we live has only been inhabited for 20 years, since it used to be the attic of the building. We'd lived there for 5 months. It's quite modern and bright, nothing to be scared of. However, last month, I offered to keep the dog of one of my students, a lovely young fox terrier, only for 3 weeks while she was out of the country. I love dogs, but living on the 6th floor without elevators is a deal breaker for owning one permanently. The first night was terrible. The dog couldn't stop whining because it was so used to sleeping in the same bed as its owner, but that isn't too much of a thing, mostly my girlfriend in all honesty. To be able to get some sleep and reassure the dog, I went down and slept on the couch. The dog was silent for the rest of the night, and I woke up in the early hours at around 6 or 7. That's when I heard what I thought to be my girlfriend walking down the wooden stairs. I heard the cracking of wood and light steps going towards the couch. I was half awoken, but frankly felt that it was too early to show it and start conversation. That's when I felt her sitting on the couch and leaning on me, and when I decided it would be time to turn around and kiss her hello. It's an L-shaped sofa, and I was lying on the smaller part, but when I turned around, there was nothing. I listened intently and could hear her upstairs gently snoring. Obviously, I freaked because I have a history of sleep paralysis, and I hate it when it happens. And so I thought for the next day that was it. Sleep paralysis. I hate it, but at least I know it's nothing hostile. A few days later, my mum and my cousin came to visit us in Prague and spend Christmas holiday together. They slept on the same sofa, and I was really happy because the dog wouldn't whine anymore, as it was not alone downstairs during the night. After their first night, we woke up, and my mum asked who went to the toilet in the early morning. I didn't, neither did my girlfriend, as far as she said. My mum then told me that in the early morning at around 6 or 7, she heard one of us go to the stairs, walk towards the bathroom, which is after the corridor between the couch and the entrance, and stop for a few seconds before the couch. She said she felt like she was being watched, just like I had before, but that it was a bit early to wake up and chat. It's only after we told her about my first experience that she became pale and asked if we were pulling her leg. We weren't. A few days passed, and my mum and cousin returned to Belgium. My girlfriend goes to France to celebrate her mother's 50th birthday, and I decided, because I did not feel too courageous about being home alone after these experiences, to let the dog come up with me. 2 nights ago, I was sleeping on my stomach. The dog was by my side, and I again, in the early morning, heard someone either sighing or laughing lightly. I thought it might have been a sleep hallucination, but the dog got up, with its ears all pointing, as if they were trying to hear where the noise was coming from. The dog kept looking in the void towards the direction where I thought the noise had come from a few seconds prior. Now, the dog has returned to its family. and I'm home alone until Saturday. I have never wanted my girlfriend to be back more than now. When I was a child, I lived in the Mojave Desert, which is ground zero for a lot of paranormal events, notably Roswell, Area 51, and also just tons of abandoned towns, which makes it all that much creepier. I was living relatively close to Edwards Air Force Base, which was pretty much Area 51 before we knew Area 51 existed. Anyway, in my childhood home, there was never any yelling or fighting. My parents were married and still are, and I was not abused in any way. Initially, I thought what had happened was a result of my parents hitting me for some reason, but I didn't see their faces because they did not have any in this instance. I remember that night so vividly. I didn't know about shadow people until I was around 15-16. Even then, I didn't connect that I had experienced them. I recently clicked a few months ago when I had thought back to the experience. So this one night, I was getting ready for bed, and I was in the bath. I was playing around with the bubbles in the bath and putting it on my head to make a hat. I'm pretty sure I washed it off my head, because I doubt I would go to bed with bubbles on my head. I'd gone to sleep, but awoke, feeling a presence. Like I said before, I thought it was my parents, but these beings had no faces, and were just shadows. I had a nightlight, so I could tell that there was something there. I saw 3 or more of these shadow people moving around the front of my room and talking to each other about me. I don't know what exactly they were saying, but I knew they were speaking because they kept pointing at me and huddled up together as if, okay, what's the plan, y'all? I wasn't afraid of them until shortly after. After looking at them for a hot second, one of them shoots over and puts me in a chokehold while pushing me onto the pillow. I couldn't breathe and was squirming around trying to free myself. While this was going on, I see what you would see if you looked through a kaleidoscope, except instead of looking through it, it's like I fell into it. It reminded me of when you play PS2 and the camera would fall into that abyss of fog when it booted. I thought to myself, that's the last time I put soap on my head. I have never been abused, but I imagine that that is what it felt like. I fell into a deep-ass sleep. The morning after, I went up to my mum to tell her about it. At this point, my only experience with anything even slightly paranormal was at the movie Monsters, Inc., so I did not have the vocabulary to say what those beings were. My parents were super conservative and Christian, so they didn't let us find out about all that stuff. The conversation went like this. Mum, I saw Scully last night, and he hurt me. But Scully's a nice monster. He wasn't nice to me. Hell is spooky, right? After that, I didn't sleep for 3 days straight, and had several panic attacks. My mom kept giving me Benadryl to make me go to sleep, but that just made me hallucinate, and made me become more afraid to go to sleep. I straight up saw bugs crawling out of the walls. Thanks, Mum. I was convinced that if I went to sleep, I would be attacked again, and this time, I would perish. Eventually, I did fall asleep, and fortunately, nothing has happened to me since then. Me and my brother are adopted, both from different families at different ages. He was horribly abused before he came to our family, but He was only 2 and doesn't remember any of it. But the damage is done. He has explosive anger and is a compulsive liar. He'll make up stories that supposedly happened in the past. He'll say that our adopted parents continued mistreating him in the same way his real parents did, and that he was never treated fairly, and they only ever tried to buy his love. This is all rubbish, mind you. Our parents are the most gentle and loving people I've ever met. They kept him housed, fed, and dressed all his life. He's 26 now. When he was in high school, he used to cut his arms for attention, all superficial wounds, and never had to get stitches. In other words, he's a drama king. We aren't sure if he's bipolar or has some form of autism. He never wants to cooperate with therapists or doctors, so he's never been diagnosed with anything nor medicated. Now let me clarify, we love my brother Duke. My whole family has loved him since the day he joined us. He is quite eccentric, but we've always appreciated him for his differences. Even though he has violent outbursts, we have always just accepted it and moved on. About 6 months ago, he started dating this woman, Nina. She's 10 years older than him and has 2 children aged 16 and 10. Their relationship is a whole different story. But basically, she takes a lot of opioid pain medication and started to give him some. He has an addictive personality and is spinning out of control. He took a belt to her son because he was talking back, and he's constantly getting rid of dogs. By no fault of their own, mind you. He says that they're misbehaving, but really they're just reacting to how he is behaving. In June, it's my father's birthday, so one evening we went out to dinner to celebrate. My brother was messed up on some pain medication, and he tried to deny it, but we could tell. We aren't stupid. The dinner ended up in a yelling match between Duke and my mother. My mother forced him into the car and drove him to the hospital, but he refused to go in. He probably didn't want his girlfriend to get in trouble for giving him her pain medication. Eventually, she came and collected him, and they went home. During the next few weeks, I got a lot of messages from both my older brother and Nina about their fights. Apparently, they think I could help them, but I'm not in the relationship, and I repeatedly explained that to them, that they need to speak to a therapist or marriage counselor, not me. Their relationship continues to spiral out of control. Nina is apparently trying to get pregnant during this time. Supposedly, she succeeded, but miscarried. Now this could be true, but I'm getting major drama queen vibes from her as well. I really think she's just trying to rock my brother's boat. They go on a road trip, and I get a call from my brother. He's screaming and crying and telling me that Nina is walking down the highway opposite the traffic and refuses to get back in the car. I tell him to calm down and beg her to come home. Eventually, she gets back in the car and they head home, and all seems well. About 2 weeks ago, this stuff starts to show up again. Apparently, Nina is pregnant again, but is threatening to abort the baby because my brother, according to her, does not deserve the baby. I don't know why she got off birth control if she was just gonna do that. Duke calls my uncle, tells him that Nina was punching herself in the stomach and that he was furious. He drives his truck into a pole right out in front of the hospital, saying he was trying to end it all. Fortunately, there was a mental health facility right across the parking lot, and he gets voluntarily admitted. But after the 72-hour hold, they release him, and he remains medicated on whatever they prescribed him until the bottles run out, because he lost his insurance after that, and didn't deem it necessary to go take the steps to remain medicated. He doesn't stay out for long though. Just a few days after that, he's readmitted, but involuntarily. The details are a bit unclear to me, but the cause was from another fight between himself and Nina. During this stay, he is compulsively lying to therapists, not partaking in any activities, and making a fool of himself as well as my entire family. He refuses to see Nina or take anything she tries to deliver him. My uncle and cousin go on visitation to talk to him. The conversation lasts for about 3 minutes before he freaks out and leaves. We find out that he has sold all of my grandfather's rifles who passed away 10 years ago. My aunt is in agony, knowing that she has lost family heirlooms because of my brother's ill decisions. The next time my uncle goes to visit, he threatens to end my parents' lives, as well as to snap Nina's neck. Present day, my brother is due to be released this afternoon. There's still a .22 missing. Duke says that he's going to a homeless shelter and getting his dog from Nina. And then goodness knows what's going to happen. Please, pray for us. This happened my junior year of high school. One of my best friends invited me to a Halloween party at her house with our school friends and some of her friends from her previous school. When I got there, my friend introduced me to this girl, and we actually hit it off really well. She told me that my friend had told her a lot about me, and they knew each other through their parents' work. We started talking about our interests and were decently flirting with each other. Now, I had gotten out of my first real relationship earlier that year, and I was not one to hop around from girl to girl. So being really flirty with someone on my first time meeting them was not something I was accustomed to doing. At the end of the night, we were sitting on the ground floor of my friend's house and ended up kissing for a little bit, which again was moving really fast for me. We started texting after that, but I kind of had a weird feeling about her and couldn't really see myself being in a relationship with her. But prior to realizing that, we had made plans for a date with my friend, who threw the party, and her boyfriend. When the day of the date came, I had come down with an 101.7 degree fever and felt very, very out of it. I called and explained to her that I was sick and was extremely sorry, but I wouldn't be able to make the date. This was a solid 3 or 4 hours before we were supposed to meet, so I wasn't pulling this last minute. Her response kicked off the most backwards period of my high school life. She responded by saying, "Well, I wasn't going to tell you this early, but I have brain cancer, so I don't have much time to go on dates." The strangest part was she asked me not to tell anyone about it. She stated that this was because her father didn't want her to use the cancer as a way to work people over and get stuff, which I found odd. Now a little backstory. I had a football coach who had passed away of cancer, and my friend's mum, the one who threw the party, also developed cancer around the same time. So the topic of cancer was heavy on my heart, and I felt incredible guilt, and being the emotionally charged person I am, decided to go on the date. During the date, she started saying that she really appreciated me coming and the way that I treated her. This made me feel better knowing that I was helping. At some point near the end of the date, we were walking towards my car when she again brought up that she appreciated the way I treat her. She followed it up by explaining that she wasn't used to guys treating her right because she was assaulted sexually when she was younger and actually had to have an abortion due to a forced pregnancy at the hand of a male relative of hers. My heart broke for her, as she sounded like she had endured a lot of hardship, on top of the fact that she was going to supposedly pass away from cancer next year. I was an emotional wreck following the date, because it was a lot for me to take in, but I knew that if I all of a sudden stopped speaking to her, I would never forgive myself. At this point I had a small sense of suspicion of one of the things she told me. especially the part about not telling anyone under any circumstances. That, coupled with a couple of things that she had said on our date so far, about 3, regarding what she wanted to do with her future, saying things like, "I want to try out this hairstyle when I get older." After she said these things, she seemed to tense up a bit, but I chalked it up to her coming to terms with the fact that she would be unable to ever do these things. My suspicions grew, and eventually I decided to try and investigate. Her father was a doctor at the place where I went for doctor things, and my personal doctor was a family friend of mine who knew her father as well. I asked her if there was anything I could do to support or help her regarding her cancer. My doctor looked at me and said, "What cancer? She doesn't have cancer." I immediately became filled with anger and messaged her, telling her what I had learned. She told me that just the day before, she had learned that her diagnosis was a mistake, but her tone was very melodramatic and not at all what I would expect in response to finding out you don't have a deadly disease. She tried to cover her tracks and was asking me why I would question her and was saying, "I thought you cared about me." I am livid, blocked her on everything as well as her number, and fall into a pretty deep depression for a few weeks because of how yanked I was about this girl and how this interaction led me to have major trust issues with women, which I still have not gotten over. A few weeks later, I received a Facebook message request from a name I didn't recognize. It was her. She'd made a fake profile and was telling me I was being so immature and told me she had some explaining to do. I of course didn't answer, and that was the last I heard of her. Until a year and a half later, I had signed up for an ACT retake exam at my local university, and when I got there and sat down, I looked in front of me, and 3 seats to the right, guess who was there? We ended up talking and she apologized for everything that she did in a relatively believable manner, and I forgave her. I never found out if any of the other things she told me about her home life were true, but I made sure to avoid her at all costs, which was pain because she worked at the Cold Stone that was 2 minutes away from my house, and I had to go to the one downtown, which was a pain. I came across her real Facebook profile recently, and she seems to be doing well, which I'm glad to see. But as far as our interactions go, let's not meet again. When my family first moved into our new house in the country, I was happy about finally getting out of our previous home that was haunted. Unfortunately, it wasn't even a week of being there before the activity started in our new house. I still remember the first event that started the whole thing. I was in the house alone while everyone else was outside. I had to run out and ask my mum something, so I went through the kitchen on my way to the back door. The faucet was not running when I went past it on my way out, but as soon as I came in, I found it running full blast. Not just the cold water had been turned on, but the hot one as well. This was an event that happened several times to everyone in the house. Not to mention the dishwasher would start itself in the middle of the night, which us kids were blamed for, of course. That is, of course, until it started right in front of my stepdad and I. He called a repairman to check it out, since it happened so frequently at first, but there was nothing wrong with the switch, and the repairman showed us that it was impossible for the thing to start itself. We, as a family, talked about these little events in general conversation from time to time, but there was another event that we were all experiencing that we didn't talk about, because it was the kind of thing that was questionable. I had been seeing what looked like someone walking past the windows of the house from the corner of my eye almost daily, but felt stupid saying something since I never saw it while I was looking at the window. and when I ran out to see who was there, of course there'd be no one. Since no one else had mentioned seeing this, I had the idea that perhaps I was the only one, until we'd been there around 8 months. We were all sitting in the living room watching TV, when I saw someone go by one window. I looked over at the window, and there was nothing there. But just as I got my eye on the window, the figure went past the other window in the room. I immediately noticed, and my mum and stepdad looked over at the window at the same time. I knew right then that they had seen it too, so I asked them if they saw someone going past the window. They and my brother all said yes, and we sprinted out running to see who it was. There was no one. When we came back in, I opened up and told everybody that I had been seeing the thing the whole time. At that point, everyone came out and said they'd been seeing it too, which gave me a huge feeling of relief. At least I wasn't crazy. We had all been seeing it regularly, but were too afraid to say anything for the same reason I didn't. The shadow people we were seeing in the corner of our eyes continued for several years after we moved in, and then it just suddenly stopped out of the blue for a while. My mum told me later, after I was out the house for a while, that she was occasionally seeing it again when I brought it up. It was just another one of those weird things that happened in the house that we all eventually had to get used to. I lived with my parents and my 2 Staffordshire Bull Terriers and was enjoying the 6-week summer holiday from school. I got home one day at around 7 p.m, and after a long day out with friends and playing football, I decided to get a snack from the fridge. My dad was at work, Mum was in the living room with my 2 dogs who were asleep on their bed, and all I could hear was the very faint sound of the TV through the 2 walls that separated the kitchen from the living room. Here's a brief description of the kitchen. We had a small space under the stairs that you could access from the kitchen, where we kept shoes, coats, and some other bits and pieces. The fridge was literally 5 steps away, and the space under the stairs would be on your left-hand side when facing the fridge, and is nearly pitch black, as we had no light in there. I opened the fridge and had a quick browse of what was on offer to crave my hunger, when out of nowhere there was a deep, guttural growl from the space under the stairs. This growl lasted for about 5 seconds. I used to think that people exaggerated when they said that they froze in fear, but I literally couldn't move. My eyes opened wide and my hands started to shake, and after about 10 seconds of standing completely still, I slowly turned to look at the space, as I knew that it had come from there. As I turned and looked at the space, there was nothing. All I could see was the darkness, but I had that feeling of something staring at me intently. The gut feeling screaming at me to run away and that I was in serious peril. I was certain that something was going to crawl out of the darkness and drag me into it. The worst part was that I had to walk past the space to get to the kitchen door. I slowly made my way to the door, and the feeling of danger and dread intensified with every step I took. I ran the last few, swung the door open, and bolted into the living room. My mum looked at me, and she saw how white I was and asked why I was shaking. She asked what was wrong, and I told her what happened. I also asked if the dogs had growled, or if there was anything on TV that could have made a noise like that. But my mum said she hadn't heard anything from the dogs or TV that could have been perceived as a growl. My mum grabbed a torch and headed to the kitchen. Sure enough, she came back and said there was nothing there, and that it must have been my imagination. But I know what I heard, and I know that my gut feeling was not just my imagination. There was something under those stairs that seriously wanted to hurt or terrify me. I haven't had any other experiences like that since, and I always become nervous if I'm left in the kitchen alone. I'm 22 now, and still refuse to go anywhere near this space under the stairs. I grew up in a really old house. It was nearing 100 years old right before I moved out, and it used to be a post office or something way back in the day. The house is creepy and big. There are 3 stories, but I was never really scared living up there or anything, although I did like to scare my friends with all kinds of made-up stories, and they always believed me too. The only weird thing that ever happened was when my parents left over a December holiday, and I had the house to myself all week. Me and my friend were bored, just sitting outside on the back porch drinking some beers. All of the doors were locked except for the one closest to us. It's just a metal frame door, fitted with glass that you can see outside of, but from the outside you only see your own reflection, like a one-way mirror. Well, while we're just chilling and talking, someone bangs on the door so hard, I was surprised that the glass didn't shatter. My first thought was that my parents came home early and caught both me and my friend drinking underage. We go into the house and there's nobody, and we looked everywhere. About 2 days go by and nothing happened. Now my room was covered in posters like most teens. I wake up in the morning, and every single one of my posters are taken off the walls and cupboards, and are lying neatly folded on my chair. There's no one in the house but me, so either I did it while sleepwalking, or it was someone else. To this day I have no idea what happened, and nothing weird ever occurred after that. I would be reading or playing with my toys, and as all young children do, I began to reminisce of recent events and conversations. Then, as I remembered something specific that was said, I would literally hear a spoken word or two whispered directly into my ear. It would shock me because I knew I was alone, but what used to scare me was the black shadow man who I would then notice standing there. The second my eyes tried to fixate on and rationalize what I was seeing, it would instantly disappear. He was always wearing a thin, brimmed hat. This all happened in South Florida. I never felt paralyzed, and every time I saw him I was wide awake in broad daylight. I saw him when I was playing in the living room, and only at one particular house. It was unnerving. I have a story to share about my ex. We met back in high school by chance. I was sitting in the library one early morning, doodling a little in a notebook, when Tim came up to me. We shared a lot of common interests, and I was deeply impressed by his drawing skills, as he sketched a few drawers for me. For the first few years, things were fine. We were great friends, and got to know one another very well. He was the oldest of 3 children, and the only boy in his family that was fairly religious. Not the say grace and Hail Mary religious, but definitely the say grace over the meal for 5 minutes in church every Sunday religious. I'm not really religious myself, but I wouldn't call myself an atheist either. But I don't believe whatever it is demand we only talk to him in churches or over our food. Now Tim was a nice guy, and I did develop a crush on him, but I always felt whenever I made a move he would back off and avoid it. So I assumed it would never evolve into anything else. Things, however, changed at the end of my junior year. At the time, my family's visa in the US had been misfiled, and we were told we had 2 options: leave the US for a year and reapply, or fight it and risk being deported for 5. At the same time, my dad had been fired from his job for some BS reason, and my maternal grandmother wasn't doing so well. This in turn affected my mum very badly, because this was her last living parent and she hadn't had a chance to help her father during his last few years. This left her with a lot of guilt and what ifs and could haves that worried her endlessly. At the same time, I was entering my senior year, 3 credits short of graduation early, and my sister was in the 2nd year of college. There was also the fact that the USA was pretty much the only home I had ever known, so it was a question of when and not if. So my dad does the only thing he can think of. He asks some of his co-workers and family friends if they could take my sister and me in for the year, so that I could finish high school at least. The family I ended up living with for the year was absolutely wonderful. They only had 1 son, and we were friends, and they treated me like family from day 1. The mum was Catholic, but she was one of the really great ones that wouldn't preach her faith into others or judge you by it. They had sort of adopted a lot of their son's friends who didn't have a nice home life, and when one of them came out as gay, she just smiled and said to him, "God doesn't make mistakes. You are exactly as you are supposed to be." I started to call them Mum and Dad version 2.0 really fast. I felt they deserved those titles too for everything they helped me with. They took me into their home and let me live with them absolutely free. All they asked for was that I studied hard in school, did a few chores when they asked, and respected their no alcohol and no sex rules. Easy. It was here though that Tim started to show a side that none of us liked. At first it was just minor stuff. He would call almost daily to ask what I was doing and to hang out. And if I said I couldn't because of something, like studying or wanting to spend time with other friends, he would call my other parents to check if it were true. I wasn't new to relationships, but just because I was technically an illegal immigrant in the States at the time, I had so many things on my plate and didn't notice the signs. Things got even more stressful as my other father got prostate cancer and needed help getting to and from the hospital. It did it. So I had to prioritize my school and other family opposed to my boyfriend and friends with other responsibilities. For whatever reason, Tim didn't like that. He started demanding I spend more time with him than whatever I was doing, especially if I were free. I liked his family, they were nice people, but I'm also an introvert, and if I didn't have at least a little bit of solo time, I can't recharge properly. Soon the pressuring started. No, not to sleep together, but to go to church. His church. He kept saying how it was important, and I'd feel great going there and love it, and it was a Christian duty. This was right when the whole Muhammad drawing controversy happened, and I never found comforts in religion, much less the kind where they pressure on Christian duties. I avoided it for a while, until I finally got the courage to tell him that I wasn't comfortable with the idea of going to church, and giving everything I need to ensure to graduate, as well as my other family's own problems. I didn't feel I had time to add church to this list. You would think it was okay, but not for Tim. He got offended and started demanding that I give a better reason as to why not go. He even went as far as to go to my other mother and talk to her about the idea of us going to church. She thankfully told him that it was my choice, and regardless of his feelings about it, he needed to respect that. Then the creep factor went up a notch. He started showing up uninvited, both at my home and school. He had graduated at the time and was in college, and it was easy for him to get into school grounds since he had gone there too. He would go looking for me all over campus, trying to guess in which class I was in. Both my other parents and even other brother once caught him trying to peek into my room through the blinds to see if I were home, after asking if I really was there or not. My other mother told him that was inappropriate, while my other father told him to never do that again because it was unacceptable. My brother, at first, made a few jokes about him, calling him Ogles for trying to peep in. But after he caught Tim doing it again at 2 in the morning while I was asleep, he told him he was officially going into creeper territory and was going to kick his ass if he didn't stop. I stopped laughing whenever Tim was around. I become more and more reserved to the point where everyone but Tim commented that I didn't seem happy in the relationship at all. And it was also weird because the furthest we ever got to in dating was holding hands. He wouldn't even let me kiss him on the cheek in private. The final straw came when I was over at his place, trying to figure out how to tell him I wanted to go back to being friends, when his mum suddenly said that it was so nice that we were following tradition. I asked her what she meant, and she told me that she and her husband had been high school sweethearts and married right after high school, and that Tim was doing the same. I full-on panicked. We hadn't dated long. We barely did anything that could be called being a couple, and I was heading back to Denmark after I graduated. I was only 18, and nowhere near the age where I felt ready to marry. Not to mention with how conflicted I was feeling about the relationship. I couldn't see this ever working out. I was starting to see that our relationship, as a couple, was more toxic than healthy. The first chance I had, I told him in private that I didn't feel like this was working out. I still wanted to be kind and not embarrass him in front of his family, and I've never felt breakups should be a public display. Tim didn't take it well. He pleaded and begged, saying if I just tried to go to church with him I would see the light, and that it was ruining the family tradition. He tried to argue that if we married we could stay in the States, but I didn't want to marry for a green card. In the end, we both parted in tears and with things unresolved. A few weeks pass in silence, and I focus on school and just recharging. I'm getting ready to graduate and dealing with the reality that my biological parents won't get to see it because of our finances, and try to focus on the positives, that my other family and sister will at least be there to see me walk to fetch my diploma. Then, joy upon joys, my mum wrote to me, saying that she's going to visit for a week to see the graduation. I wanted both of them, but was so thankful that at least one of them would be there. I happily told my friends about it, and we all started talking about who we would give our graduation tickets to. I can't remember how many we had, but I remember I had a few left over after inviting my mum, other parents, and 2 brothers, and one of my friends asked if Tim was coming. I wasn't sure if I wanted him there after what happened, but at the same time, I had been back to his when we were friends. And like an idiot, I reached out and asked if he wanted to come as a friend. Tim became irate, ranting about how I was being so selfish. His anger was so explosive that it shocked me, and he finished it by saying to me, "There are 5 priorities in life: God, family, health, school, and friends, in that order. But you don't seem to get that. Your order is family, friends, school, health, and then God. You need to sort yourself out." At the time, I was way too shocked to react at first. Before I muttered a small, "That's how I see things. They are what matters," before walking away, giving my extra tickets to a classmate who needed them more because he had one of those massive close-knit families. Graduation comes. I receive my diploma with cheers and pride, knowing that a high school diploma doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. To me, it's the proof I need to show I can dedicate my time to learn. I toss my cap, look for it afterwards, and immediately go off to get the real thing. Our school kept them hostage so we could behave during the ceremony and look for our family. When I found them, I can instantly tell something was off. They smile at me, but clearly something's bothering them. I asked them what was wrong, but they tried to brush it off, making an excuse that someone had those stupid annoying horns with them. I didn't believe them, and in the end my mum told me that Tim had showed up. She knew a little about the drama going on and figured he was just there to say congratulations. Spoiler, he wasn't. He said he needed to talk to her about me and how I needed to be saved, that I was going to hell because I wasn't embracing the church or what my womanly duties were meant to be. She asked him what he meant and he said to obey her future husband. She lost it. I did too when she told me. We weren't engaged, and even if I was, I'm not some dog that's meant to follow orders. In the words of a pastor I once had, God made Eve from Adam's rib, not from his head, for she was not above him, not his foot, for he is not behind him, but his side, for she is his equal, and so that he can place his arms around her to protect her when needed. I'm not religious, but I've always liked this way of explaining Adam and Eve. So to hear that Tim thought I was his to order around made me furious. The last time I spoke with him, I yelled and threatened him, telling him how dare he think he had any right to decide what I deemed important in my life, and that he had another thing coming. He tried to argue that I needed to be saved or whatever, and I just screamed that I didn't need to be saved, I didn't want to be saved, and that I was happy as I was. He stared at me, saying I didn't mean it. I told him I did, and that if he kept pushing it, I didn't want to speak to him again. I told him it was making our friendship unbearable, and if he didn't learn to respect other people's opinions, the next relationship he'd be in wouldn't work either. He got angry and said I was going to hell, in a fit of rage, and I told him that our relationship is hell, and that you've made it that way, to which he immediately left. I lived in the States for a month after that, and we didn't talk. His family tried to plead for me to apologize to Tim for what I had said, but told them that I had meant it because of his constant bullying. After that, I wasn't welcomed at their house anymore, not that I ever wanted to go back. Tim tried to reach out to me again during the years, with some sort of over-religious story and how I was like the main character. I told him I would like it if we could be friends, but if he was just going to send me more religious texts, he needed to delete my info. We haven't spoken since. He ended up dating a dear friend of mine a few years later, only to mess it up in the exact same way. Ironic, right? My friend had asked if I was okay with them dating, to which I told her honestly that wasn't for me to decide. Just because he was my ex didn't give me any right to say who he could or couldn't date. I reminded her to not let him bully her about religion, as she had just left the Mormon church. To this day I think he's still single and trying to find some girl he can save with religion. And while I wish for him to find his special someone someday that meets his needs willing, I will say this. Tim, I'm glad we never met again, and there is now an ocean between us, so I doubt we ever will. I think there is something paranormal in my apartment. I moved in October 31st, 2018. Without the knowledge or knowing a previous tenant had died in the apartment. I'm a paramedic, so I can deal with death a little differently than others. So when I found out from my downstairs neighbor, Gina, it didn't bother me. According to my neighbor, the tenant, Katie, was a younger female in her early 30s, who had reluctantly given birth to her first child. Gina said Katie was a nice woman, but had history of drug abuse and had an abusive boyfriend who was also her drug dealer. Shortly after, Katie gave birth to her child, and she was found dead in the apartment from a heroin overdose while holding the baby. I did not ask specific details of where she was found, because that I didn't want to know. I work night shift, so I am usually sleeping during the day, unless it's the days off where I try to turn myself around and be a normal human being to interact with the world at daytime. For the past month and a half, I've been waking up between 3 and 3:30 and can't explain why. Sometimes I will have to use the bathroom, and other times I just wake up and am unable to go back to sleep. About a week ago, something eerie happened. I was asleep in my bed with my dog and cat when I woke up to what sounded like a woman screaming bloody murder in my ear. It didn't jolt me awake or startle me. I was more confused than anything. Afterwards, I was unable to fall back asleep and just stayed awake until the afternoon because I worked that night, and when I looked at the time, I noticed it was 3:13 a.m. I got home after work at around 8 a.m. I laid down and had trouble sleeping because my downstairs neighbor Gina and her husband Robert were pulling up carpet and pounding on the walls with what I can only assume was a hammer for 6 hours, because when I woke up at 2 p.m. they were still at it. I attempted to go to sleep around 10 p.m. that night, but probably fell asleep at midnight. I woke up at 3:12 a.m., annoyed not being able to fall back asleep, but something was off this night. I sleep with my door cracked open, so that the cat can come and go as it pleases, and I've never had an issue with it until this day. I felt as if someone was watching me in the hallway. I then rolled over and scrolled through Facebook for about an hour and a half, and decided to go run a bath. I got out of the bath at 5 a.m. and walked into my bedroom when I heard a sound at the front of the apartment. I can't really describe the sound, but if anything it sounded like a thud. I walked out of my room and into the front of the apartment and saw that the light cover to my kitchen light was hanging. I thought it was odd, but really didn't pay attention to it and put it back. I took my mum to breakfast that morning and decided to tell her what I had experienced. She knows about Katie's passing in the apartment, and she has also experienced paranormal activity personally. My mum kind of shrugged it off and said I have difficulty sleeping due to working nights, and that a light cover falling isn't a big deal. Respectfully, I agreed, and after breakfast we went to the grocery store, and I returned back to my apartment, and my brother came over to help bring up all the groceries because I live on the second floor, and no one likes doing multiple trips to get groceries out the car. While I was finishing, my mum called me and asked where I was. When I told her I was still at my apartment, she asked if I was messing with her. Confused, I said no and asked why. At that point, my mum told me to hurry up and get to her apartment. When I arrived, my mum was in her bedroom looking visibly nervous. She was supposed to have come and inspected her sprinkler that day in her apartment, and so she had her bedroom door shut. She said that while she was laying in bed, someone knocked hardly on her door 3 times, causing the entire door to shake. After opening the door, she noticed no one was there. She said that she checked the entire apartment and no one was in it, and that the front door was still locked. Trying to recreate the sound and shaking of the door, the only possible way was if someone knocked directly on her bedroom door with force. After leaving my mum's apartment, I went back to mine, and once I met the front door, I had an uneasy feeling. I can't explain why, but as soon as I got up to the door, it just felt like a negative energy. I went in, greeted my animals, and decided I was going to take a nap, due to barely getting any sleep the night before. I went into my bedroom, which is in the very back of the apartment, and went to lay down. My dog followed suit and jumped on the bed and came to her spot. She sleeps in the same spot every time we go to bed, which is at the top of the bed right next to me. I noticed when she jumped on the bed, she was slow to get to her spot. Once she did, she immediately looked up at the ceiling above my head, prompting me to look and see if there was a bug. There was nothing. My dog proceeded to look at the ceiling and look away for short periods of time. Approximately 20 minutes before, she refused to sleep in her spot and went to the end of the bed to lay down, still looking at the ceiling. I was unnerved, but somehow managed to fall asleep. When I woke up about an hour later, I was drenched in sweat, like you would have to be breaking a fever. I kept my apartment at 68 degrees Fahrenheit during the summer. I have a fan on me and sleep in light clothes. I usually get cold and do not wake up hot, so I thought this was odd. Later that night, I had a friend over and we were sitting on the couch watching movies. Let me explain the layout of the living room. When you walk through the front door, you're immediately met by a wall. If you look to the right, there is a closet, and if you look to the left, the living room is right there. I have a sliding glass back door that leads to the balcony, with the blinds that almost every apartment complex has. I have a large sectional couch, and the only way for it to fit is block that back door. At around 2:30 a.m. while watching a movie, horror of course, we heard 2 knocks directly behind our heads on the back door. We both looked at each other, and I said, "There's no way that a person could be on my balcony." I open the blinds within probably 15 seconds and look out. Obviously no one's there. At this point, I'm getting creeped out. He ended up staying until sunrise at 6:30 a.m. and then left. I didn't plan on going to sleep until it was daylight at this point. I had trouble sleeping during these days because all I could think about is what kind of spirit is in my home, or is it something worse? I used a Ouija board when I was 14, so I have my own experience from that, and it's not something I want to relive. One of my co-workers is very spiritual and cleanses her house weekly because she buys a lot of antique furniture, so she is the first person I contacted. She told me I needed to go get white sage and that she would send me cleansing prayers, but that I needed to do it soon. I unfortunately worked all weekend, and this was Friday, so I could not go to do it immediately, so I stayed at my parents' house until I could. After work, I went to my apartment and was met with the negative energy again once I reached the door. I had to get my cat and dog because I was not letting them in there alone. It might be silly, but I didn't want to go in there, and I'm not going to leave them there. The next day, I needed to go back and gather some clothes and sleep clothes, so I convinced my brother and his girlfriend to go with me. My brother's skeptical about paranormal things, but his girlfriend, like I am, is a believer. I take it seriously to not provoke or enrage with a spirit, so I had chosen to ignore. Unfortunately, my brother did not get this memo, and as we were walking up to the door, my brother said, "Maybe I'll believe it if it moves the blind or something." I told him not to taunt it, but he didn't listen. I grabbed what I needed and headed back down to the car. When I got to the driver's side door, something was telling me to look up at the balcony. And when I did, the blinds were moving back and forth. I looked over at my brother and his girlfriend and said, "Do you believe me now, and the look on their faces confirmed that they saw the exact thing I did. I'm gonna smudge the apartment, but I'm curious if anyone knows what type of spirit I might be dealing with. I haven't been hurt by anything, and everything that has happened to me has been subtle and not alarming. I'm moving out next month. I wasn't renewing my lease to begin with, so this has nothing to do with not staying there anymore. This all started happening mostly after Gina and Robert were remodeling their apartment. They recently just got back from a trip, and anyway, they saw me outside and said they would speak to me since they got a home a few weeks ago, and they don't talk to me and are acting strange since then. Gina is avid for being outside watering her garden, but I've noticed her garden is dying, and I don't see her outside anymore. Robert's vehicle hasn't moved from its parking spot since they got back, and he usually leaves every day. Could there be something sinister going on here? I live in an old house that was converted into a triplex. All of the doors in my apartment push themselves open randomly, and any toiletries left on shelves in the shower are thrown to the floor. The first year or so living there, it scared me each time it happened. For example, I would be laying in my bed, and the door, which would be fully closed, would push open. Nobody else was home. I'd freak out and check everywhere for an intruder, or I would be in the living room and would hear a big commotion from the bathroom. I'd go look, and my shampoo and conditioner and body wash would be on the floor. Again, there's no one else to mess with stuff, and my boyfriend would complain to me about the same stuff happening while he was home alone. I half expected all my cupboard doors to fly open at once, and the kitchen chairs to flip upside down one day. To make matters worse, my boyfriend's son went through a night terror stage during that first year. I was chatting about it with my friend, and telling her how we tried everything to help him stop having the terrors. She told me not to think she was crazy, but wondered if there was a possibility it could be something paranormal. She didn't know about the other stuff, so her saying that gave me goosebumps. I hadn't considered it before, but putting it all together scared me. We've been living here for 5 years now. He grew out of the night terrors, and I'm pretty sure all of the weird things that happened are due to pressure and temperature changes, but for good measure, I say hello to the ghost when a door opens on its own. This started 1 year ago, around the beginning of September 2017. I would occasionally wake up in the middle of the night to strange noises coming from the hallway and seeing strange shadows walk past my open door. As the months went by, they got worse and worse until it happened. September 2018. I was lying on my bed, tossing and turning trying to sleep, with the worst paranoia I've ever experienced. After hours of attempting to fall asleep with no result, I finally decided to go into my mum's room. I slowly climbed out of my bed and grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and began slowly walking out of the room, flicking my head back and forth, scanning my surroundings. It seemed to suffocate me. I walked through my kitchen to get to my mum's room, where the clock read 2:15 a.m. I walked straight into my mum's room, just to see my 2 little sisters already hanging up the bed. Now I know that I'm 14, but sometimes being scared makes you feel vulnerable. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the lamp illuminating my sister's room and made my decision. I went to Alia's and Olivia's room and jumped in the bed, keeping the lamp on. I hugged the wall and finally managed to obtain slumber. Next thing I remember, I was sitting up in bed staring at the black abyss beyond the open door. I slowly whispered 3 times, "I see you." And after the last syllable left my mouth, I noticed a little glass circle in the palm of my hand. It was all fogged out except one little clear circle. I looked through the hole in the glass, and what I saw burned an image in my mind which I'll never forget. A young boy was standing in the doorway staring at me. He was dressed in an old pioneering outfit with a top hat, his hair long, shaggy and black, his long face pale white. In fact, everything on him was black or white. Everything but his eyes, they were yellow. I immediately put the glass down, and as I did it, it was like he teleported, because the next thing I knew he was crouched right in front of my face and pulled the biggest smile. His teeth, the same color as his eyes. I burst awake, eyes wide open, facing the ceiling. I tried to get out of bed but couldn't. I was terrified. My ears were ringing to the point where I couldn't hear anything else. It was so loud yet so quiet. I felt pressure on my chest like someone was pushing really hard. But that wasn't the worst part. The boy from my dream was standing in my doorway, staring at me. He wasn't even moving. It was enough for me to panic myself into oblivion. I tried to get out of there ASAP, but nothing worked. After what felt like an eternity, everything snapped back into place. No more boy, no more ringing, no more tension. I could move again. After that experience, I immediately noped right into my mum's bed between the kids already there, and finally fell asleep at 3:15 a.m. My family owns a country house in rural Missouri that I grew up visiting pretty often. There were plenty of beds and rooms to sleep in, but I always stayed in a room in the basement, since it stayed nice and dark well into the day, and the bed in that one was by far the comfiest. Ever since I can remember, I always had a weird feeling when I went down there, but I was usually so tired from running around and doing farm work all day that I had no trouble falling asleep. So, it never really bothered me. Stuff started to really pick up around the time I was 12 or 13. The one thing that really sticks out was one night when I was drifting off to sleep. I kept seeing a human-sized shadow walk past my room. This room was at the end of a hallway, and I saw it slowly walk back and forth past my room about 3 times, almost like it was someone on patrol or something. I always kept the door slightly ajar, and the bright hallway light on because of the creepy vibes. Finally, I saw whoever it was stop in front of my door and wait there for 3 minutes before moving on. The part that really freaked me out and confused me was that the hallway boards are normally super creaky. Like even my little 12-year-old body would make these things pop and crack like crazy. So I knew whoever was walking in the hallway at night couldn't have actually had any weight on them. The other thing that happened that really freaked me out actually caused me to stop sleeping in that room again. I was laying in bed, but this time I had just woken up and was laying with my feet hanging off the end of the bed. When clear as day, I feel a single finger trace a line from the heel of my foot to the tip of my big toe. I even felt the damn fingernail at the tip of the finger. That same day, I went to my grandma and told her everything, and that I didn't want to stay in that room, and could she please make a bed up for me in an upstairs room. It was then that she told me the family secret. My great-grandpa built that house in the early 50s, but in order to do it, they dug up the grave of a Confederate soldier and moved his grave to a new spot 50 yards away. They had a priest bless the new spot and everything, but apparently that wasn't enough for the soldier. The adults in the family kept this from us kids so that we wouldn't get freaked out staying there. There was another time that I had been running around and came inside real quick to use the restroom. I ran through the living room and saw an old man wearing overalls facing a giant bookshelf and looking at all of our family photos. As I ran through the living room towards the bathroom, he just slightly turned his head and smiled at me. My grandpa was also somewhere around the house, so I just assumed it was one of his friends or people working for him and thought nothing of it. I never saw him again after that, but a few years later I was flipping through old family pictures and recognized one of the people. It was the same man I had seen that day wearing the exact same outfit. Jean overalls and a plain white t-shirt, with the same sweet smile on his face. I asked my grandma who that was. Turns out it was my great-grandpa, the man who had built the house and who died 20 years before I was born. Even though I never saw him after that, I would always come back to the living room to see his favorite old rocking chair rocking back and forth. It never freaked me out because I knew who it was, and that he was probably just saying hi and enjoying his old favorite spot in the afterlife. Also, by the time I had told my grandma about all the weird experiences I'd had, and she explained to her that several of the women in my family have a knack for seeing ghosts and stuff, it made me feel better, because I literally see something or have very freaky dreams every time I visit. Things I've also heard and seen include a random little girl watching me while I was sleeping, a young Native American man watching me and saying something I couldn't understand, random objects moving to different places when no one was there, a baby crying when there was no baby around, and just general nuisances from that Confederate soldier in the basement. I think he enjoyed trying to scare me, so I really didn't like him. The stairs in my house are so old that they creak when someone goes up them. And since everyone has a different weight and a different way of walking up the stairs, I can usually tell who it is coming up. So one night, when I'm the only person in the house who's awake, I hear the stairs creak one by one, starting at the bottom. Unfamiliar footsteps. When they reach the top, I convince myself to take a look. I check. No one there. I didn't hear anyone go down the stairs, and the hallway that connects to the top of the stairs creaks just as loudly, and the door at the bottom of the stairs is closed. There was just nothing there. Nobody used the stairs. It could be explained by the house being old, but the stairs making noise one by one in the middle of the night, that just doesn't happen. I am a country girl. I don't live on a farm, just a half-acre parcel with my husband and our only son. We have 2 horses, 2 cows, 2 pigs, so my morning is spent doing chores both inside and outside. Our only son Michael is 5, and since he is an only child, we decided to host a foreign exchange student for a year. We chose a girl from Denmark that enjoys riding horses called Margie. She was with us for about a month when we decided to take her to Olvera Street in Los Angeles. Olvera Street is a huge outdoor swap and meet-like setup where you can get anything from hand-blown glass pipes to the best tacos, albeit the greasiest I've ever had. We arrived, and I couldn't believe the traffic and crowds. It was kind of intimidating at first, but as we drove into a parking lot that you had to pay for, I felt better knowing that there was someone to watch the cars, and we walked the short distance to Olvera Street. Right outside the entrance, there were Native American dancers performing, and we were all caught up in their performance, and even joined in the dancing. Olvera Street was absolutely overwhelming, and there was stuff everywhere, and the crowds were scary, as I worried that my son would get lost. I had never seen crowds like this, and had never been in one either. We spent the day shopping and eating the most delicious Mexican food. It was at this point I realized that Taco Bell was not Mexican food, and by the time we exited Olvera Street, it was beginning to get dark. We were absolutely exhausted, and walking the short distance to the car, As we approached the parking lot, it was comforting to see that there was still an attendant, so I had no fear nor worries. As we entered the lot, I was absent-mindedly going through the pictures I had taken that day. I had my huge purse, the bag of things that we bought, and my very expensive camera. Michael and Margie were dragging several steps behind us, and my husband kept inching his way closer to me. He got right in my ear and whispered in a very alarming tone, "Lock the doors when you get in." I understood the words, but the alarm in his voice made me look up to see 5 or 6 big guys slowly approaching our direction. All of a sudden it dawned on me what was going on, so I told the kids at least 3 times to lock the doors when they entered. I was trusting a 5-year-old and 15-year-old whose native tongue wasn't English to understand to do what I said. As we started to get into the vehicle, the guys quickened their approach, and as I slammed my door, one guy grabbed the door handle and began tugging it aggressively. Luckily, I had instantly locked the doors as I closed it, and looked back to see that both Michael and Margie had locked theirs, as one guy on each door tried in vain to open them. As my husband started the engine, the guys kept saying that we needed to pay for parking in the lot, and we told them we already did, to no avail. We backed the car up slowly as to not run over the 6 guys that surrounded us, and we inched backwards. They all kept pounding on the car saying we needed to pay, and we had backed up far enough and began going forward, only to see 4 guys blocking the exit. Now my husband is perfectly calm, just inching towards the exit with the guys, who were getting even more aggressive, pounding on the car and saying we needed to pay. Inching slowly more and more and more, we reached it. Now these guys had no intention of letting us leave without paying, but my husband, being the calming force that is going to get us out of this safely, inched past their backliner-sized men blocking the exit, and he finally turns onto a street. We thought we were safe, and we will run. My husband safely got us out of the parking lot, but inadvertently pulled onto a one-way street going the wrong way. We had 6 lanes of cars ahead of us, and we had no way out. He started going forward, and the cars are getting closer and closer, and at the very last moment, he pulls into the parking lot of a liquor store, and that's where he stops the car to take a breath. My heart was absolutely pounding, and the poor sheltered little soul was still in that parking lot, so proud of the kids who did exactly what they were told and staying calm in the face of danger, and so thankful to my calm-headed husband, who was the superhero that day and every day for me. I will never go to LA again now, not even for free tickets for my favorite band. I'm still very much a country girl, and I'm afraid that big cities are simply not for me. I was working in London for 2 weeks, staying in a flat owned by a friend of a friend while he was out of town. About halfway through the job, I got food poisoning and was pretty sick for 3 days. I still had to work. I got home one night about 12 and was chilling in the front room reading a book before going to bed, when I felt someone else was in the room. I looked up, and there was a Native American dude stood in the middle of the room. He was wearing some kind of vest or waistcoat, and I see dark lines running up his forearm. He raises a hand, says some stuff directly to me, and just vanishes. I wasn't scared, just a bit strange, and I went to bed. A few hours later I woke up and wasn't sick anymore, and I drew a portrait of him in my sketchbook. A few days later I was back home, sat on some stairs waiting for my girlfriend, with the name Little Crow popped up into my head, and I wrote it next to my drawing. About 6 months later, I hadn't mentioned this experience to many people. The original friend whose flat I stayed in gave me a book of Native American history, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and there was a chapter about a Dakota chief called Little Crow. The photo of him looks like my drawing. He always wore long sleeves because he was shot by his brother when he was younger, and the bullet passed through both his arms. The wounds became infected and left ugly scars that he was embarrassed about. I live in this ranch-style house. My bedroom is at the back of the house and has a single picture window that looks out onto the backyard. The window itself is probably 7 to 8 feet off the ground because the entrance to the crawl space was directly below the window. Also, there's this tree in the backyard that's involved. It's 20 feet from my bedroom window. I don't know what kind of tree it is, but it's an evergreen tree, and the bark can be pulled off in stringy bits. I'm around 5'6" tall, and if I'm standing at the base of the tree, the branches closest to the ground would still be over my head. So these branches that were closest to the ground were at least 6 inches off the ground. It happened in 1998, sometime in late August or early September. It was after school started. I was a sophomore in high school at the time, and I remember it was on a Sunday. My mum dragged me to church that morning. My friend and I had started talking about religion. It was nothing specific about religion, but we were talking about it in general. After church, my mum and I went out to eat lunch. When I got home, my friend called. We continued our conversation, and I took the cordless phone to my bedroom, and I was pacing back and forth while speaking to them. I'd take a few steps towards the window, turn, take a few steps towards the opposite wall, and repeat. At one point, I walked down towards the opposite wall, turned to face the window, and that's when I saw this shadow that looked like a person from the neck up. I quickly tried to find something that could have cast a shadow of that shape, but couldn't. Then I realized the shadow had a 3D quality to it, and I audibly said, "Oh God." I suppose it realized I could see it, and it appeared to drop. I ran towards the window in time to see it run across the backyard to the tree. It started to climb the tree. It got to the lowest branches and it stopped. It stopped climbing and looked at me to see if I was watching it. While it was looking at me, it grabbed a few of the branches. It held the branches for a bit and then started climbing again as it vanished. My friend heard me say, "Oh my God," and asked me what was happening. I told him what I'd seen, and he told me to start thinking of God because, according to him, what I had just seen was a demon. A few days later, I go back out into my backyard for another reason. I look at the tree, and it reminded me of what happened. I went over to the tree, and that's when I noticed that the couple of branches this thing had grabbed and was held onto were dead. I could tell these branches specifically were dead because all the needles on these 2 branches were brown, while all the other needles on the tree were green. A few days after that, all the needles from just those 2 branches had fallen to the ground and were laying in a pile. Several years later, while working the graveyard shift as a security guard, I gathered up the courage to call this famous late-night radio talk show and told my story. The host asked me if the eyes were glowing red. I told him no, because this thing's eyes weren't glowing at all. He said that in his experience, if the eyes were glowing red, it was a demon. Otherwise, it was something else. This happened to my cousin. This was years ago, but we have a family home in the province of the Philippines, and we refer to it as the White House because there are supposed to be ghosts there. In Filipino culture, ghosts are all white. If they're another color, they're demons. I don't completely remember why we were there, but I remember it was time to eat dinner. So our uncle told my cousin to wake up his mum who was sleeping downstairs. My cousin, Jared, didn't want to go up there because he knew that's where the ghosts were. So my uncle said, "It's up to you, your mum won't be able to eat them." So Jared got really worried that his mother wouldn't be able to eat dinner. So he went up the rickety old staircase and entered the first 3 rooms. He saw his mum sleeping under the blanket, so he went to shake her awake. Before he could put his hands on the blanket, he heard a voice call out, "Jared?" He quickly turned and saw his mum standing in the doorway. When he looked back at the bed, the blanket was laying completely flat. Before I go into the nitty-gritty of the story, I do need to share some information for context. One of my brothers had gotten into the drug world, just skimming the surface I'd say, and ended up in jail and recently being released again. Traffic fines with some drug possession charges. Needless to say, he knows a fair few users and pushers and has introduced the more respectable ones to some of the family. One of these guys is called Paul. Paul is a fairly harmless guy and has been in and out of clinics in a bid to get control of his life back. His drug of choice, crack. He's had a pretty severe drug habit since he was a teen. When he first met my brother, and while they weren't always friends, they'd recently reconnected when Paul moved back to town to be closer to his family after getting clean again. Like I said, he's nice enough when he's not using, and since most of his family are also drug users, he didn't want to stay with them since he wanted to try and stay clean. So Mum offered to let him stay in the spare bedroom, which isn't that weird since we've had various family friends stay over for months at a time here, so we're fairly used to having people come in and out of our lives. Around that time, a friend who had left town straight out of high school came back for a visit, staying in the next town over. She decided to hold a get-together for a bunch of us, since this was one of those you're gonna be trapped here for life rural areas, so a fair amount of people from school were still here. When we were younger, there was a big rivalry between 3 of the bigger towns in the area, and most of the partygoers were coming from my town. It's changed a lot, but back then there were a lot of fights and tension between the youngs and teens of the town. Of course, I needed a lift out of the town in question because the car was being used, so Paul offered to give one, since he was a friend and was heading out that way anyway. I got the lift, everything worked out well, and the party went off without a hitch, ending at about 1 AM, and as we're adults now, no partying all night. We had a few people who didn't want to leave, but eventually we got to lock up and crash for the night, and all seemed well at about 4 AM. I am a light sleeper, but even if I hadn't been, the banging on the front door probably would have awoken me anyway. My friend rushed out of her room and went to open the door, thinking it might be one of the partygoers returning for something, but I stopped her, and we instead turned on the porch light and peeked through the lounge window to see what was going on. The lounge room juts forward just a bit from the door and has windows facing in towards it, so we could see the area fairly well, especially with the lights on. There was a guy and 2 girls frantically banging on the door. The guy had long messy hair and really baggy clothes. The 2 girls looked like they were more dressed up to party. One of them in a miniskirt and bra, she seemed to have lost her shirt somewhere, and the other in a short black dress and really tall heels. Neither of us recognized them, though we had a few people come to the party who were friends of friends. The weird thing, and this was the reason it was most suspicious, was that there were no other sounds, as in they weren't calling for us to open the door, or help, or anything, just pounding on the door over and over. That seemed really strange to me, since you'd expect that if they were party guests they'd be calling out to us by name. or at least trying to explain through the door. I kind of poked my friend into getting the phone and making a call to the cops about 5 minutes later, and then a car's headlights shone on them as I was keeping a watch through the window. They hadn't even noticed me yet. They were just banging. As a vehicle pulled into the driveway, out of the driver's side came Paul. He ducked back and pulled something out, which was a crowbar, then started screaming at them to get the hell out of there or he'd beat them. They definitely took note of that because they all kind of lurched back and started laughing. It was the first vocal sound they'd made the entire time, after a good 15 minutes of pounding. It was a really weird laughter too, hyena-like and really discordant. I can't really describe it, but it sends chills down my spine, and I watched Paul take a step back when it started. I think that they caught him off guard, and it creeped him out. But he kept yelling at them to move, and they eventually began leaving. Except they didn't run or anything, they just turned and walked off, as if they hadn't just been pounding on someone's door, or had a weird laughing fit. Paul stood there for a while watching them, before coming to the door, and we let him in. He was mumbling about crackheads and junkies, but he seemed very shaken. My friend was still on the phone, waiting for the cops to show up, and when they did, they took our statements and did a sweep of the neighborhood. They said they'd have a car go by every now and then, but that they couldn't really do anything more than that at that point. Paul ended up staying in the spare room, and my friend and I went back to our beds, though I didn't really sleep well for the rest of the night. In the morning, I caught a ride home with Paul. My friend coming along since she wanted to visit another friend, and we chatted about the party and what happened, kind of talking ourselves into thinking it was just a dumb prank by someone's friends. Paul didn't really say much about it and kept quiet for the whole ride back. I never heard anything about it again, and frankly, since it was in another town, didn't care too much about it. Like I said, we'd kind of rewritten it in our minds as some kids having a prank after drinking too much. A bit of a scare, sure, but nothing dangerous. So flash forward to a week ago, when Bro comes back from jail. Paul has since moved out of the house. He'd slipped back into drugs during the time, as my mum is big against any kind of drugs and won't allow them on the property, but returned to town again a few months ago after a clinic stay. Anyway, he and my bro were talking in the play shed. It has a small campfire and is used for hosting visits and playing cards. And I'd come in with popcorn to share when we got talking about dumb stuff that happened at parties. I was telling my brother about the fight we had with the hyena people, and laughing about them when Paul told me that we were very lucky that night for several reasons. Apparently when he was younger he used to run with a group who would invade homes for fun. They'd take their drug of choice, get smashed, pick a house to terrorize, and a few people would open the doors, and when that happened they'd rush in, attack the householder or whoever opened the door, and grab whatever they could and leave. However, they were kind of dumb, smart, paranoid. The lack of talking was because if someone figured out the people, they'd be able to identify the attacker by the sound of their voice, and they decided that no matter what, they wouldn't speak at all during the invasion. They'd just bang over and over again until they got attention. If no one opened up after a while, they'd just walk away to make it seem like it were a prank. And no voice identification meant that no one would get caught, since it'd be too dark to see their faces. Paul said he'd gone to see an old buddy that night, and he had had a few friends over. They talked about how dumb they were as kids doing these home invasions, and how lucky they'd been that they never got caught or seriously hurt anyone. Some of the younger group that were with them kept pestering about details about the invasions, and some of the others had indulged them. But Paul was busy talking to someone else about something and eventually changed topic. However, just before he left for the night, after some of the others had brought out their drugs and started using, he overheard the blonde guy saying that he wanted to have a go at invasions, and they should hit the house of the big party that all the guys from the other town were in, i.e. the house we were staying at. Paul panicked a bit and tried to call the house, but we missed the call. Fearing the worst, since the guy was also leaving, he raced over, but not knowing the town very well and having a bit of car trouble, he was scared he'd be late. He said he didn't really want to get his friends into trouble by calling the cops, since drugs were involved, but he was also really worried because he was pretty sure the guy was showing a knife to some of the others at that point. He finally arrived, making it in time to chase the three off the property. Apparently, the day after Paul went to talk to the cops about it, leaving some information out about the drugs, and some arrests were made at that point, but I don't know more beyond that. He said he finally felt enough guilt to talk to the cops about it, after he realized that someone he knew personally could have been hurt, especially when it was someone whose family he owed a lot for helping him out. So yeah, in hindsight, we were pretty lucky that Paul was around to save our hides. Sadly, he's gone out of town again to attend another rehab clinic, as my brother convinced him to do so after he confessed to being on ice. But he did get a homemade chocolate cake out of the deal after I heard the truth. I had a long-time employee we called MacGyver, because he had such a knack for fixing or improving anything with whatever he had on hand. An example is a storage cabinet that had the handle broken years ago. Instead of fixing the lock, he strategically placed a magnet that holds it closed, and it's still there today. He died of cancer in 2010, and just a few days after he passed, I accidentally broke a shelf off the wall. I tried rehanging it with no luck. It had broken, and the screws that anchored it were missing. I threw the shelf in the garbage, but not before saying I wish Chris was still here, because he would have figured it out. I have the only keys to the office. I'm the first in and last out. The next morning when I came in, the shelf was out of the trash and rehung. Push pins were used to both hang it and stabilize it. Exactly the type of fix that he would have done. To this day, I have no explanation for how that happened. When I was 14, my family and some of our friends went to the myrtle plantation in St. Francisville. That was a terrifying experience. When we got there, I felt like this shroud engulfed me. Before our tour, we were walking around, and I heard, "Where's Cornelia?" and just thought it was my mum's friend asking about her kid. And maybe I heard her wrong. Her kid's name was Cameron, but when I asked her husband where she was, he said she went to the bathroom inside. When the tour began, I kept feeling distracted like I was dreaming. I was barely listening until our tour guide told us about the owners and the slaves that killed her master's family by accident. Chloe wanted to give her mistress and her children food poisoning and accidentally killed them. One of their children's names was Cornelia, and they were buried where I had heard the voice. I had to ask the tour guide twice before I could believe it. Then towards the end of the tour, we were taken to the trees in front of the house, where they hung slaves. I remember walking to the tree line and suddenly feeling as if no one was with me, and I saw flashes of people hanging there, and I heard weeping. I almost passed out and told my mum I needed to sit down, so she walked with me to a bench near the house. When she asked me what was wrong, I told her and began to cry. That evening we all went to this Mexican restaurant. I couldn't eat because the food was making my mouth hurt, like I had an ulcer, and I went to the restroom to find 2 sores in my mouth. Then that night at the hotel room, I woke up to the feeling of someone watching me. and I see this black shadow figure near the foot of the bed. I had to turn on the bathroom light just to go back to sleep. After the tour, they allow you to go around and take pictures of the outside of the house. The only photos they allow of the inside are of this mirror that supposedly the souls of the mistress and her children are stuck in. My mum took a ton of pictures on the outside, and we didn't look through them until we got home. We actually captured something in the photo. My mum didn't notice it, but when I looked I found her, Chloe, the slave that accidentally killed her mistress and the children. She was standing behind my mum in the picture. My mum had taken a close photo of the window trying to get a photo of the inside of the house, and you can clearly see my mum's reflection. And then standing behind her, a figure wearing a turban on her head and period clothing. She had no face. My mum had taken 4 photos of the window. In the first, you can see my brother standing behind my mum and the chairs on the porch. The second is the same. The third is the one with her standing behind my mum. And the fourth is the same as the first 2. It freaked me the hell out. My mum also took a few of the mirror as well. In the reflection you can see all of us, my sister and her friends up front, both with white shirts. But in the reflection there are also 3 black orbs. You can see them clearly because of my sister and her friend's shirts. A large orb and 2 smaller ones. For weeks, I felt like I've been watched by something. Even when I talk about it now, I'm feeling like I'm reliving it. That strange, dreamlike feeling, and my throat is closing up. The myrtle plantation is one of the most haunted in Louisiana. I visited a number of them, but have never felt as scared as I have there. Chris is a Christian, raised through and through. He's not one of those forceful Bible bashers, but get him on the topic of religion and he'll talk your ear off for hours on end. He believes that the judgment day is coming soon, in his lifetime, as most Christians do, and how anything that goes against the Christian faith is demonic and therefore evil. He is also a believer in a lot of conspiracy theories, from how the UN is a front from sending money to terrorists in the Middle East, to how global warming is caused by Russian submarines detonating bombs under the Arctic ice, to aliens and alien abduction. Alternatively, I'm an atheist, and don't go for any of that nonsense. No matter how many ancient alien documentaries or Bible passages he quotes as proof of his claims to the truth, although I am a firm believer in ghosts because I've seen them ever since I was a child. Despite our differences in beliefs, we've been good friends for almost 20 years, due to the fact that we respect each other's views and never let our discussions on religion and the paranormal get out of hand to the point of raining blows down on each other. The night that this happened played out just like any other night. He had dinner, spent some time playing music in his stack of vintage cassettes, and scolding one of his cats, Bingo, for knocking down some of the World War II model planes that he builds for a hobby. It was around 10:30 p.m, which according to Chris was late, and he decided to call it a night. He was awoken maybe an hour later to hearing scratching sounds at his bedroom door. So thinking it was one of his cats, he goes to open it, expecting one of his furry companions to come sauntering in. There was no one. Thinking nothing much of it, he closed the door and went back to bed, and just as he was throwing the doona back over himself, he heard the scratching again. Getting up again, the scratching stopped as soon as he opened the door. Being a little annoyed, he stepped out into the hallway and flicked on the light, wondering if it were his cats playing in the hallway and that they ran off when they heard the door opening. But the hallway was empty. He checked the bathroom thinking they may be hiding there, but found it empty. He looked in the kitchen and saw nothing there either. Chris, confused but too tired to give it any more thought, went back to bed, but left the bedroom door open a crack so that he wouldn't have to get up again, in order for his cats to just let themselves in. He was falling asleep again, and then he felt the mattress near his feet sag, as though someone was sitting on it. Figuring it was one of his cats, he said goodnight to his little furry sleeping companion before he could drift off to sleep. That's when he felt his hair being stroked and a soft woman's voice whispering, "Pretty boy, pretty boy." My friend opened his eyes and saw the figure of an older woman, mid-70s to early 80s, leaning over him in bed, smiling down over him, her hand moving rhythmically in a slow stroking motion over his hair. He let out a slew of curse words, leapt from the bed, grabbed his pillow and spent the rest of the night sleeping in the tub. Chris called me the next afternoon to confirm our plans over the weekend. I at first thought when he told me about the events of the previous night, with nervousness in his voice, that he sounded like he wasn't sure if it had really happened or not, or had just had a bad dream, and his brain hadn't processed that he was awake. Chris was just starting to describe what the woman looked like to me over the phone, when I stopped him and suddenly asked, did she look like an older lady with short black hair, kind of slightly old and hunched over? He was genuinely surprised, exclaiming in an almost unbelievable voice, "Yes, how did you know that? I've seen her at your house numerous times now, but I've never said anything to you because I didn't want to scare you." There was a long silence on his end of the line, like he was trying to process what I just revealed to him. Chris's voice finally came back, shaking, and asked me, "Are you serious?" It was now that I wanted to say that it was just a joke, because I know how nervous Chris can get when it comes to talk of ghosts and anything that doesn't conform to his beliefs. But I decided to just be honest with him. I figured it would be easier for him to accept his first ghostly encounter instead of lying to him. I told him yes, that I'd seen her on occasions where I was over at his house, but I told him that she wasn't a bad spirit, and that I didn't get any ill vibes from her whenever I saw her, or felt she meant harm. Not surprisingly, this didn't make Chris feel any better, and he kept bombarding me with questions like what she was doing there, how long she had been around, and what she wanted. And I told him that she just probably enjoyed being in the house that she used to live in when she was alive, and keep watching over it. I told him that I didn't really feel like she was going to go all poltergeist in the house, and that she was just curious about her new roommate, and not to worry about her. But Chris, being opposed to all things supernatural and believing anything like ghosts go against the Bible, didn't believe me, and said he would have a talk with his minister from his local church to see about getting his house blessed. I assured him it wasn't necessary, but I could see his point of view on such a thing. I mean, after not believing in ghosts all his life, only to be confronted by one would be the same as me being an atheist, suddenly having the existence of God proven to me. So Chris and his church minister held a short service at his house, whereby at the end, Chris was told that the old woman had found peace throughout their prayers and was able to move on. I visited Chris's house a week after the blessing, where after some time of hanging out and having him show me his latest model airplane, did he ask me, "Do you know if that old woman's still here?" I shook my head and said, "Nope, can't see her anymore," even though she was standing in the doorway between the hallway and the lounge room. I figure there's no sense making the poor guy worry over something he cannot control. My grandma's house is chock full of weird stories going way back. Pretty much everything weird and scary has happened in the hallway leading to the spare bedroom. My grandma would see my grandpa's silhouette walking down the hall. He'd stop at the door to their bedroom and peer in, and she'd ask if he needed something. He wouldn't answer and would keep walking. Peeved, She would get up to ask him again, only to find him in the living room sleeping or watching TV and insisting he'd been there the whole time. My mum has heard someone calling her name from the same hall, and once we were there alone house-sitting while my grandparents were out of town. They were due back late that night, and my mum and I both heard heavy footsteps coming from the hall. She told me they must have come home early, and as she went to greet them, she realized there was no one there. The guest room at the end of the same hall has a TV that will turn on by itself. They also had a couple stay there, and neither one was particularly superstitious. The next morning, the husband was unusually quiet. He finally got a chance to talk to my grandma alone and said very simply, "Someone was watching us last night." He had seen a figure standing in the corner of the room staring at them, and had been so frightened that he'd just closed his eyes and tried to go back to sleep. When my grandma pressed for details, he kind of shrugged it off and didn't want to talk about it anymore. There's also a middle bedroom between the spare room and my grandparents' room, which we have always just called Tipsy Danger's room, because I used to stay with them so often. I was on my bed once when I heard a thump and then a skittering noise, like something had jumped off the bed and was running across the floor. I thought it was the cat being weird, so I sat up to see what she was doing, only to find that the cat was at the foot of the bed staring intently at the doorway to the hall. I looked around for a bit and was unable to find anything. My old neighbours were moving out and paid me £50 a month to keep their old house clean and locked up while they were trying to sell it. One day, a random couple from a few doors down came to my house to tell me that they had seen someone inside the house and wondered if it was me. I grabbed my torch, and me and my dad ran over to the house thinking that some squatters had thought they'd hit the jackpot. But when I went in, the place was completely empty. I checked every single room and cupboard inside the house and couldn't find a soul, so I brushed it off and thought it must have been the owner's daughter or something, as she'd left before the couple came to mine. I spoke with the couple a few days later and told me that they were absolutely 100% certain that they saw the bedroom light turn on and saw two children playing in the room. I told them that it must have been the owner's daughter, that she has two children, and they told me that they had spoken with her and she hadn't been to the house all week. I laughed it off, thinking that the couple must have been seeing things, but ever since that day, I've had a very weird feeling come over me every time I walk into the house. It's sold now though, so the ghost kids are no longer my problem. I have a story about a crazy ex. He told me he loved me on the first blind date. At one point during the date, the topic of kids came up. I forget exactly what he said, but his response was, "Don't you mean our kids?" There were so many red flags, but he was supposed to be the best man at my friend's wedding, and I the maid of honor, and she kept pressuring me to give him a chance. A week later, I told him I was going to class, so my phone was going to be off for the next 2 hours. Afterwards, I turned my phone back on to see I have 10 missed calls and countless texts asking me where I was and why I wasn't picking up. I freaked out and broke up with him over it. My friend called me screaming, telling me I broke his heart and that he was crying his eyes out over me. And I stupidly decided to take this guy back. Around Christmas time, I took him to my friend's Christmas party. Before we left, we exchanged gifts. He gave me an expensive $100 necklace, a giant box of chocolates that was almost as big as me, and I gave him a $25 band shirt from Hot Topic. Other crazy things he did during the course of our 2-week-long relationship. He told my dad when he first met him that he came from a family of heroin addicts and that he liked to drink and do drugs. It was the first time he told me that too. He constantly tried to force himself onto me, even within the presence of others, and tried to sleep with 9 other girls, including my friend, during the 2 weeks he claimed to love me. My friend and I didn't speak for a year after I finished with him for good because she was so mad at me. I was fired as the maid of honor as a result. Don't let people set you up on dates. It doesn't work out most of the time. At least not for me. So, I'm pretty sure I accidentally invited something into my house. I named it The Aula, after the short story by Guy de Maupassant, where a guy does the same. It started when I lost my keys. A bunch of us were at a friend's house in a small village outside of town. They were in a band together, and I was their default roadie / tag-along, and we performed at the local venue that evening. Since his house was closest to the place, we stayed over there. We were probably about 18 to 19 years old at the time, and we were a rowdy bunch. So when our friend's mum, whose house it was, asked us to steal a roll-up carpet that she liked the look of from a garage down the street, we were up for it. The great carpet robbery went off without a hitch, right up until we were jogging back up the hill to the house with this thing on our shoulders. That was when the button on my trousers broke and my trousers fell. I tripped over them and the contents of my pockets went flying into the night. I found my wallet and phone, but my keys were nowhere to be seen, and I was fearful that an extended search might lead to us getting caught. So I had to give them up as lost forever on some country road in the middle of nowhere. 2 weeks later, I was reading in bed when I heard them fall. I had a half-attic conversion, which was a pretty big space. The rest of the floor was taken up by a spare room with a little storage space left over in the ceiling above it. There was no furniture in the middle of my room for the keys to have fallen from, let alone a way for them to have been there, since I lost them about 12 miles away in the aforementioned middle of nowhere. Yet there they were, right in the middle of my carpet, and I heard them land there. After this, strange things started to happen around the house. I'd hear things in the spare room next to me, like someone moving around, but there'd be no one there when I'd check. I'd wake up to find my empty glasses beside the bed, despite being certain I hadn't drunk any of it, and my computer would randomly turn itself on in the night, waking me up with a sudden whir of its fan. One morning I was awoken by some baby birds tweeting loudly somewhere in my ceiling. I had noticed a bird coming and going outside my window, and it had obviously found a way into the space between my ceiling and the outside tiles of the roof. Just as I was contemplating how the hell I was going to deal with this, there was a loud, honest-to-God snarl and an equally loud bang on the roof. The tweeting stopped instantly, and I never heard it again. The snarl was like a dog or something, full-throated and furious. The bang was like someone slamming a fist onto a table. Another instance happened while I was at work on a Saturday morning. There was no one in the house save my girlfriend, who was having a lie-in. She was on her side facing away from the bedroom door when something sat on the other side of the bed. She felt the mattress go down with the weight of whatever it was, and she froze. She didn't dare move or open her eyes. After a minute or two, the weight lifted, and she was gone. When she eventually got the courage to look around, there was no one there. She was so freaked out she rang me at work to tell me about it, and then left the house to spend the day in town until I got home. So yeah, I accidentally gave some entity keys to my place, and it took that as an invitation, and moved into my spare room. It hasn't done anything hostile so far. In fact, an argument could be made that it's trying to be helpful, but nonetheless, still freaky as hell. Set the Wayback Machine to late summer / early autumn of 2001. I was 19 and had just transferred from the big city college I went to for my freshman year to the college in the small town near where I grew up. I was attempting to keep the relationship with my high school sweetheart going, but surprise surprise it failed not long after. Anyway, I digress. Not long after I started there, I met the man who would soon become my best friend, and remains so to this day, Jimmy. We'd first meet up at some stupid lock-in event, and had kept talking after that. I wouldn't call us friends at this point, but we were good enough acquaintances that he invited me to attend a White Wolf gaming session he ran. Well, as a nerd who played D&D and Magic the Gathering all the way through high school, I leapt at the opportunity. So we do the adventure, and then afterwards, Jimmy asks me if I'll help him park his car. Jimmy and everyone else who had a car that lived in the dorm parked in the dorm lot on weekends, as the dorm lot was free to use Friday night through Sunday evening. You needed to have a plan for your car though during the weekdays. This town has permit parking, and the permits are only available to permanent residents, i.e. not college kids. This was to prevent the cars the students would bring to school from clogging up the town street parking. The school had a big student lot, but it was a joke. It was just a big unpaved gravel lot, way beyond the campus boundaries, that had no security and was basically the Wild West. Everyone who ever had to use it hated it. Plus, the school charged an obscene amount of money for a pass. So Jimmy's solution was to drive his car out beyond the boundaries of the permit parking to the outer part of town, away from the college, and park on the street there for free. It was a long walk back, but he didn't mind. Today though, he asked me if I'd follow him in my car to where he parks and give him a ride back, since it was Sunday evening, and everyone had to get their cars out of the dorm before morning. I didn't have a problem with parking, since like I said I grew up there, and my grandma lived in town, so I could just park in her garage. So we load up in the decrepit old family minivan that Jimmy's parents had given him when he went off to school, and they had brought a new vehicle. And we drive the few blocks to my grandmother's house, where I get my car and proceed to follow him out where he parks. My car wasn't exactly a banger either. It was a 1989 Ford Country Squire. You know, one of the giant old station wagons that were basically long steel tanks with faux wood grain on the side. This street ran up a hill. As we're proceeding up it, I noticed two little girls walking up it on the other side of the road. I'd estimate one to be 9 or 10, and the other to be 6 or 7. As we approach, they look behind them and speed up their pace. Jimmy pulls off at the first available spot on the street, which happens to be right beside where the girls are walking. I stop my car right by his van, just a few feet from these girls. So now picture the situation from the girls' point of view. They are out for a walk, their heads doubtlessly filled all their lives with tales of stranger danger and creepy men in old cars looking to snatch away children, and they have just seen not one, but 2 old junkers, one of them a van with curtains in the back window, that followed them up the street and abruptly stopped right next to them. The girls in unison just start hauling ass. I mean, they're booking it at full sprint, as fast as their little legs could carry them, as they charge up the hill and turn down the first side street. Jimmy gets out of his van, looks after them for a second, and then gets in my car. We exchange a look. Do they think we're... he begins. Yeah, dude. They think that we're totally trying to take them. There's a moment of silence, and then we both just lose it laughing. We probably sit idling for 15 to 20 seconds, howling with laughter, before I manage to choke out, "We should probably get the hell out of here before the cops arrive," and off we go. I can never think of the sight of those poor two girls running away up the street from what they imagine to be weirdo takers without a chuckle. Those girls have to be in their mid to late 20s now. So ladies, on the off chance one of you hears this and recognizes yourself, I'm sorry, we didn't mean to scare you, but you've given Jimmy and I an amusing anecdote we often share. Ever since I returned home from a 4-month trip, my room wasn't the same anymore. When I was there, I usually felt a warm feeling of security and coziness, or at least I didn't feel a feeling of dread or hopelessness. I'm a guy and live with my mom and 2 younger brothers in a town in a very isolated valley in the middle of nowhere, and not even in town but rather a few kilometers from it. And on top of that, my room isn't in the house but outside of it, a shed that we revamped into my room. Well, the thing is that the first night I slept there after I came back, I immediately felt a difference. The air felt heavier, and a soft breeze blew on me all night, and I felt an ominous presence standing in the opposite corner of the room, even though I had my lamp on all night, and there wasn't anything there. Looking at that corner makes me feel dread and unprotected, and I'm in constant alert. I can't even sleep. I spend all night watching YouTube videos on my phone and keep me distracted until the sun comes up, where I finally feel better. But the feeling is there, even then. Even with my girlfriend here for the night, I still can't feel safe. Tonight, I'm gonna sleep in the living room of my house because I can't stand it anymore. I'm tired of feeling insecure while in my own room and not being able to get enough sleep. I think it's progressively getting worse, and I've only been back for 2 weeks. Last night I couldn't sleep at all. I ended up passing out from exhaustion at 7 a.m. and woke up at 11 not wanting to spend any more time there. I want to know how I can fix this and what I can do that will make it stop. For context, I have some drug-addicted neighbors. My front door faces the corner of their house, and I can see part of the front and backyard. One of the wilder memories I have of my neighbor Beth is when her youngest son of 3, Damien, came over and shyly knocked on the door. I was the one to answer, and looked down at him and asked what's up. He looked up at me and asked to borrow my phone. Barely as soon as the words left his mouth, something catches my eye, and I focus over his shoulder to see Frank, the eldest son, fly back and lie on the ground. I hear an angry yell, and Louis, the middle-aged son, rushes out and punches Frank. By now, Mum can hear the fighting and begins to dial 911, and stands next to me to watch. Frank shoves Louis away, and just then Beth runs out and starts shrieking at Frank to stop. He swoops down and gets a brick from the stepping path thrown at her. He misses. Beth stopped screaming, and Louis tries to punch Frank again, and then Frank grabs Damien's skateboards and flings it at him. He misses, and the skateboard went through the front window, breaking it. There's more screaming, but then Frank runs back towards the house, snatches Damien's baseball bat, jumps through the broken window and disappears into the house. Both Beth and Louis come over, and we waited for the cops and started hearing repeated shattering noises as things get broken. The police come, and he splits once more, where he hopped the brick wall into my yard and then to the people behind. They eventually caught him on the next block. Once the police confirmed that he was arrested, Damien, Louis and Beth head back inside. Not too long after, Damien comes back over while Louis and Beth were giving their statement. He looks crushed, and what he told me broke my heart. My computer tower, my monitor, my TV, and the Xbox 360 that I had given him for Christmas once I got a PS4 were broken. I couldn't believe it. What a scumbag. Beth told me later that Frank said he did it because Damien had asked us to call the cops. He was also coming down from a bender on cocaine, which explains, well, everything. I was 7 years old at the time this happened. One day out of the blue, I woke up having this odd feeling, like something bad would happen. I couldn't put my finger on what exactly it was, so I shrugged it off. At the time this happened, I was staying at my beloved grandmother's house. I would get to her house straight from school, do my homework, and when done, watch soap operas with her. She was sweet and caring, so she would always check on me. That nighttime was no exception because she knew that I had trouble sleeping, so she would sit on my bed and rub my legs. After a couple of days upon arriving from school while having lunch at her house, I received terrible news. My beloved grandma had fallen ill. My aunt informed me that she would be staying at the hospital for some time in order to get better from hepatitis B and meningitis. I would visit her every day for over a month right after school, until one day I wasn't allowed to see her anymore. She had health complications. Doctors feared she wouldn't make it through the night, and they were right. She passed away in her sleep that same night. When that happened, I got an overwhelming sadness, even when no one had even told me yet that she was gone. That is when that odd feeling I had started to make sense. The funeral came around, and I wasn't allowed to go, since it was no place for a child. My parents tried to shelter me from the event, hiding what death meant. They said Nana went on a trip, but I knew the truth. That hurt me in a way, because I didn't get to say goodbye. The day she was buried, I remember all the family arrived at her house to spend some time together. We shared stories, looked at pictures until time came around, and we said our goodbyes and went to bed. So I followed my usual routine and went to sleep. Later, during the middle of the night, my door creaked open. I thought nothing of it, until I saw a dent formed on my bed, like someone was sitting down, and I felt a stroke on my legs. I sat up, too tired to process what was going on, and said with a groggy voice, "Good night, Nana." I waved my hand at her and began falling asleep. After that happened, I felt the mattress rose, as if she had stood up from the bed and closed the door softly. She left behind this peace and calmness. I like to believe that she came to say goodbye. Later that same year, a couple of months after my Nana passed, my mum got pregnant with twins. Everything was great. That was the news and joy that we needed. Everything was wonderful. But one day, same as before my Nana fell ill, I had this dread come over me, a feeling that something was wrong. I told my mum that I felt something was wrong, and she told me to brush it off, as it was most likely nothing. A few days after this, I sort of forgot about the feeling, carried my day on as usual and went home after school. I was alone in the house doing my homework at the dinner table, when out of nowhere I heard the sounds of babies crying from the room my parents were setting up for the twins. I could distinguish two different cries. This feeling of dread and sadness washed over me again. I decided that since I was about to be a big sister, I had to see what was going on in my baby sibling's room. Somehow I managed to gather up the courage, stand up and walk towards the door. As I approached the room, the crying started to fade away, when it was really intense before. The moment I placed my hand on the doorknob, the crying stopped. I opened up the door, and the room is empty. That night, my dad came home and told me that my mum was in the hospital, and that she would have to stay there for some time. Also, that's when she came. The babies were not going to be in her tummy anymore. Also, that when she came, the babies were not going to be in her tummy anymore. He made sure I understood they were not coming because they had passed away. I looked at my dad, muttered okay, and went to my room. I laid in bed and cried non-stop until I fell asleep. Yet I woke up in the early dawn to the feeling of a hand on my leg, but I wasn't scared. So I looked over and saw a dent on my bed, the same way it happened a few months ago. I had this undeniable feeling it was my Nana. I knew I could ask this from her. So I said, "Look out for them, Nana, please." Waved my hand and fell asleep again. In the morning I awoke, knowing that everything would be alright. Since that time, 14 years ago, I have not felt Nana's presence again. But I still get that dreadful feeling every time something bad will happen. You might think I'm bluffing, but it's true, and I don't like getting that feeling. It causes me to become quite anxious and reserved. Sadly, that odd feeling never fails. One time I knew a friend of mine would lose his mum, and I couldn't stop it. Anyway, I'm positive my Nana is still looking out for me. So Nana, wherever you are, thank you, and I hope we do meet again. After a shower, I walked towards my room with the door half open like I left it, but was frozen in fear as I heard footsteps and the sound of paper scrunching loudly in my room. There was even a huge shadow being cast from my room's alien lamp on the hallway floor. My first thought was, what's my dad doing in my room? Then I heard his voice laughing and chatting with friends and family in the lounge/kitchen. My next thought was, I hope everyone in the house isn't in the lounge/kitchen. I silently walk into the lounge room and could see everyone in the house was there and the kitchen casually chatting. My heart skipped a beat later at night. I went back to my room and noticed everything was in its place. Nothing seemed to have been touched, and the rest of the night was normal. I was 10 at the time, but was too scared to go into my room during that occurrence. That was over a decade ago, but I know 100% what I saw and heard, and it definitely wasn't a pet. We don't have any of them, and the footstep sounds were too loud to be something like a dog. It sounded like my dad's heavy footsteps. I know it can be explained by something rationally, but it still gives me the chills whenever I think about it to this day.